Under the Oak Tree. Chapter 1. Maximilian Calypso nervously paced around the drawing room. She was so tense that she didn't even recognize that she was biting her nails until the Duke of Cross came inside. When she heard his cane hitting the floor, Max hurriedly hid her hands behind her back. "Didn't I warn you 1,000 times about that nasty habit?" Sorry. Max bowed her head at her father's cold voice. The Duke clicked his tongue as he looked at the scene. "Don't embarrass me. You've got more luck than you deserve. I won't forgive you if you cause trouble to our family with your dirty behavior." Cold sweat dripped behind her back. She stiffened in fear and opened her mouth with difficulty. "I will do everything that you say, father. I will. As soon as he comes." She could tell what her father's face was without looking up. When she spoke, he always had a disgusted look directed towards her. Max tried to carry on with her words as calmly as she could. "Father, I'll try. This marriage, this." "Stop." The Duke of Cross hit the floor firmly with his cane. "Even for today. But no. Can't you just be calm for a few hours? Who the hell would want a wife like you who stutters like a horse?" Aye. Riftan Calypso is no longer a low-ranking knight. He has become one of the sword masters on the continent, and the bold warrior who has defeated the Red Dragon. If he wants to, the temple will consent to a divorce permit. Just imagining it was horrible, and he breathed loudly, his forehead creasing. For the spirit of the Cross family, you should not be divorced by a knight from the heavens. You can't let the family become a laughingstock because of their stupid daughter. She bit her lips. The objection that it wasn't her fault soared to her throat. She had never wanted to marry Riftan Calypso, and she knew he felt the same way. Wasn't it the Duke himself who pushed ahead with the marriage that no one asked for? Whether he had read her rebellious thoughts or not, her father remained icy. "If you were half as beautiful as Rosetta, no, at the very least as normal, I wouldn't have taken this road to please him." When she remembered her half-sister, whose beauty was comparable to a rose, her arguments faded away like sand. Looking down at her pale, weary face, the Duke of Cross added ruthlessly, "Even if King Reuben wants to welcome him as his son-in-law, he'll be fine even if the other party refuses. It's all because you couldn't win his heart. But, on the wedding, the next day he's gone." She was about to argue it was not about capturing his heart but that she never had the chance to have a proper conversation with him. Before such words could be uttered, Max was struck on the side with the cane, and she crouched with a gasp. She reeled from the immense pain, unable to release a scream. "Don't even think about talking back to me. Just thinking about your horrible habit makes me incensed." She nodded hurriedly for fear of the wood flying a second time. The Duke, who had his lips pressed as if to pour more poison, withdrew at the sound of a knock on the door. The quiet voice of the maid could be heard. "Lord, the Knights of Ream Dragon have arrived. Guide him to the drawing room." Max looked up at his father in terror. He threatened furiously with his gnashed teeth. "Make it clear to Calypso that you can't annul your marriage. Once again, if you insult the family, you'll pay heavily." Then he went out of the drawing room, leaving behind Max. She stood up with difficulty and leaned back against the window, waiting breathlessly for the pain to pass. The pouring autumn sunlight pierced her eyes in her painful state. Still, she managed to swallow her tears. Her situation never improves even if she cried. Instead, it will only make her look more miserable than she already is. Max clasped her trembling hand tightly. She had to keep her head straight. For a woman in this society, divorce was tantamount to a death sentence. It was not just a matter of being ridiculed, but it was an irrevocable disgrace to the family. Under the Oak Tree. Chapter 2. To clean up the taint, a man from her family would have to challenge Riftan Calypso to a duel. But her father had no son, and none of his relatives or knights in service could ever hope to match him. After all, who can fight against the swordsman who has defeated a dragon? Eventually, it could only lead to the family's honor being tarnished and her father never, ever forgiving her. Perhaps she would suddenly face death even before the process of the formal divorce would take place. This was her father she was talking about. So somehow. But will he listen to me? She bit her lips, her mood as if she was standing at the tip of a cliff. Their marriage was made solely for the convenience of the Duke of Cross and his knights. 3 years ago, when news spread across the continent that Red Dragon, hibernating in Aranthal, had opened its eyes, El-Numa Reuben III ordered his vassals to arms with stringent action. Naturally, the Duke of Cross also had to lead his knights on the expedition. But his father passed on the duty by marrying Riftan Calypso to her. She shivered at the thought of the insulting remarks that the guests had mumbled on the day of the wedding day. The low-ranking knight, Riftan, had to be dragged out of the ceremony as he could not disobey the order of the Duke. The anger and humiliation he would have felt was unthinkable. His expression of restraint was just as fearful. If only I were half as beautiful as Rosetta, maybe he will feel much better and would not think of divorcing me. Ideas drifted in her head in self-derision. Despite his low status, Riftan Calypso was a man with breathtaking features. Even Rosetta, who was mocking him for his origin, blushed at the sight of the knight. Riftan could have enjoyed a lot of romantic relationships with beautiful ladies. Such a man could have escaped having a stutter as his wife. Furthermore, his status was no longer a hindrance. In the event he marries the king's daughter, I won't be able to change his mind even if I begged him. They spent only one night together. The very next day, Riftan left with the army without saying a word of farewell. Even after that, he did not send her a single telegram. She felt doubtful whether he had even regarded her as his wife. As she clasped her face in a dismal mood, a gloomy voice penetrated her ears. What a sight worth seeing! Max looked up in surprise. Since when had a giant man been standing by the door staring at her? My wife trembling, waiting for her husband to come back from the dead. The man walked up slowly, his sarcasm dripping. She looked at him, forgetting even to breathe. Riftan Calypso, wearing a dark blue tunic and silver armor, reminiscent of a monk, looked much larger and overbearing than she had remembered. I didn't expect a warm welcome, but there's no reason to shiver like you've seen the plague. The cold words finally brought Max to her senses. The blood drained from her face at the thought that she had offended him in less than a minute after their reunion. Why, you've come, safely, back safely. What should I say? I don't know what to call him. Riftan? It seemed too much of an endearment. Lord Calypso? She thought she'd be laughed at. As she mumbled back her words, she suddenly felt an intense gaze looking at her and took a step back. She couldn't figure out why he was looking at her like that. As if it couldn't get worse, the man's face became colder for some reason. He snatched her arm and uttered harshly, "At least pretend to be happy in welcoming me." She froze as their bodies met within a hair's breadth, the smell of leather, horse, and a faint sweat piercing the tip of her nose. His masculine odor flashed across her mind, and a memory that had been buried for 3 years. Mysterious heat blossomed from his hard, penetrating gaze. He looked down at her like one looking at a raw meat, like a hound on the brink of biting its meal. She dropped her eyes in a hurry, her face burning as if she was under the unforgiving heat of the sun. With her heart beating faster with every second, memories of their marriage slowly flooded her thoughts. Her husband was finally back home. How would she deal with him now? Under the Oak Tree. Chapter 3. Take off your clothes. By the end of the wedding reception, she was led into the bridal chamber by a nanny. With the help of the maids, she washed herself clean and sat on the bed, and after a while her husband followed her into the room. Then he, who was hardened by tension, said so to her. Max didn't know his intentions, but her eyes were wide open. She couldn't understand why the man, who had completely ignored her presence throughout the wedding, had made such a demand out of the blue. She had no specific knowledge, though vaguely aware, that something secret happened between couples. The nanny said, "You have to obey your husband unconditionally and accept whatever he asks in silence." How can such unconditional obedience involve taking off her clothes? She was at a loss on what to do, but the man who threw his top over his head gave her a hard look. "Do I have to take it off?" She took a breath of surprise. Riftan Calypso was like a giant made of twisted steel. His shoulders were twice as wide as hers, his neck was long and thick, and his waist was lean and straight, akin to an elegant hound. She was ridiculous in comparison. She knew at first that he was a man of unique physique among the knights, but it was overwhelming to see him face to face. She swallowed hard. It hurts when his father hit her, what more if he is the one to hit her? "You look terrible." His cold voice made Max tremble. The man strode up to the bed and openly stared at her. His huge body, purring golden at the fireplace light, blocked her vision. "You don't like me very much, do you?" "Ah. I. He bent over her. On the face of near perfection, his black eyes held an eerie glow. The man's tight lips twisted with cynicism. Of course, a duke's daughter would never place in her heart a low-ranking knight. There has been an uncontrollable tremor in her body when she heard his voice is full of hostility. A wife belongs to her husband. If he desired, she could be beaten and a harsher corporal punishment was tolerated in her society. Max sweated with fear in the situation where she was forced to cling to his husband's generosity and that at this moment, she might have angered him. "Come here. You know what you have to do." Max couldn't urge to ask what she had to do and instead looked down at her toes. A dark shade fell over her head. The man raised her chin with his long, rough fingers, sending an indecipherable gaze. If we don't do it on the first night, this marriage is considered invalid. Do you want an annulment? Caught in his dark pupils of unknown depth, she shivered. The man twisted his mouth. If you want me to go out, tell me, he said. Once we start, there's no stopping in the middle. Max's throat constricted and she swallowed hard a second time. If she went away like this, her father would surely not forgive her. She had no choice in the first place. Max closed her eyes and loosened her belt with trembling hands. The fear of being beaten by her father was much greater than the fear of being humiliated by a stranger. No. She would not end up being beaten. Perhaps, a more severe punishment would be, her father would even be back with another night in a few days. She was nothing more than a tool for her father's convenience. In the punctuating silence, Max took off her ornaments one by one and placed them down beside the bed. Only the sound of the fire cackling could be heard through the room. She could feel the man's stinging gaze as she pulled down the strap of her linen dress and pulled her arm out of the sky-high sleeve. The cold night air swept across her naked back and shoulders harshly, making her flesh erupt to goosebumps. She clutched her clothes to her chest, unable to lift them further down. Then the man put one knee on the bed and pulled the hem of her skirt in one motion. Under the oak tree. Chapter 4. And now, wait a second. The hem of the dress flowed down without resistance against Riftan's ominous strength. As she grabbed at the hem of her dress in a hurry, there was a look of irritation in his eyes. Remove your hands. Why, oh, my clothes. She looked up at him with a confused look. The man's face was enveloped in a deep shadow with his back against the fire. Max felt more afraid because she couldn't see his expression in detail. Do you want me to stay or not? Be sure. Max swallowed a sob. Her shoulders shivered as he threw her waistband on the floor without lowering his hands. The cold air swept over her exposed skin. There's no turning back now. His low voice ringing in her ear chilled her heart. He stroked her pale body stiffened with tension with his warm, calloused hands. As she instinctively tried to push, the man pulled her against him more strongly, wounding one arm around the back of her waist. A strange tingle in the spine and a curious heat were all that came from her body. Just a little bit away?" she asked in a trembling voice, but the man didn't even care to hear her. He bowed his head and kissed her breasts. She instantly opened her eyes in shock. Hot lips swirled over her soft, gentle skin. His strange touch made Max shudder. It was the sight of a grown-up man burying his face in her chest like a newborn baby. "Relieve your body." He caressed her stiff, hardened back with a rough palm. His moist breath in contact with her skin gave her goosebumps. He rubbed his rough chin on her soft skin and pushed one hand into the hem of her garment that had been covering her waist. She jumped up. The man's hand touched an area of her that she had never imagined. Her lips quivered with astonishment. What are you?" "Stay still. If you continue like this, you'll be in pain." Her legs shook in fright. The man, who only exchanged stares with her several times, was now touching her most intimate body part without hesitation. She couldn't believe it. This. Don't do it." She grasped his thick shoulders and pleaded. Under her touch, she could feel the man's body swaying and trembling. His firm skin was burning under the palms of her hands. It felt as if she was holding an iron heated by fire. Riftan, whose lips were clinging to her skin, soon brushed over her own mouth with renewed vigor. His unfamiliar, rough taste spreading through her mouth made Max's shoulder shake. While she was distracted, he pulled down the hem of her dress and lowered his hand. Her scream was sucked into his mouth. "Fuck it." The mixture of her groan and his curse came out from their intertwined lips. She struggled so much like a carp ferociously swimming in water. The deep waters that she dived in was an unfamiliar territory she could not recognize. Her legs thrashed instinctively. But she couldn't get out because she was weighed down by his rock-like body. She felt like a helpless deer struggling with a hound's teeth on her neck. "Damn it, I can't wait." He pushed his hand a little deeper, muttering in a nervous voice. Max stopped breathing. The advice of the nanny, who said, "You have to accept everything your husband does as submissively," has long disappeared from her mind. She fluttered like a fish on water under the ministrations of his hand. And an unimaginable sensation shook her whole body. No. Oh. There was no use in struggling to escape. He kissed her furiously and touched her body firmly. Max could only bite the pillow. It was hard to believe that such a bizarre act was actually happening. Her eyes were burning, and her head was spinning. She was ignorant. She doesn't know anything about this. Under the Oak Tree. Chapter 5. A little. It's going to hurt a little. The movements from his fingers finally halted after some time, to which felt like eternity to Max. In her limp tiredness, she took a long exhale. Her rigid body couldn't resist any longer. Riftan took a hold of her clothes and, pushing one arm under her waist, lifted it above her head. Their hot bodies made contact. Only then did she realize that his body, as well as hers, was slick with sweat. The man's back glistened gold in the dim lighting. It suddenly occurred to thought that she was sneaking into a blacksmith's forge and saw a golden statue. Would this be the sight when you pour boiling liquid from the furnace over a body? Her thoughts echoed unanswered as her whole body melted, feeling as if it was drowned into a pot of gold. Breathe. Take a long breath. He whispered roughly in her ears, incomprehensible to fully understand in the moment as her back trembled upon his touch on her skin. In an unconscious effort, she spread her legs and clung for life to the man's hard forearms. Then his lower body sank heavily between her parted legs. Ack! The dull pain came before realization of what was happening dawned in. Max struggled fruitlessly with fear as the man trapped her underneath him with their locked lips. She was unable to escape. Her heart was crushed against his strong chest as he pushed deeper into her body. She could only cry, raking her fingernails without mercy all over his forearm. "Oh, it hurts. It hurts," she howled. "It's because you're too narrow." Tepid sweat trickled down from his neck and fell over her face. As she unconsciously bent her body to get out of the pain, he shivered faintly and firmly grabbed her waist with both hands. Deep wrinkles were set in his forehead as he did so. "Please. Stay still." An unexpected plea came from his lips. But Max was only swallowed by the intense agony that racked her body. It hurts. It hurts. Fuck. Don't move, please. Unk. She could feel the man's body shivering and for a moment, she stopped breathing. He hugged her waist, his hold tight on her that she felt she was going to break and began to move as if he could no longer bear it anymore. She groaned at the sharp pain that came. Every time his body shifted, her own body shook like a helpless boat on a raging river. Her mind grew more and more muddy as time ticked by. "What are you doing to me?" The sheets she clenched with her hands felt as if it were on the verge of tearing. "Oh, fuck." Max couldn't fathom how much time had elapsed before he uttered a strangled moan and drooped over her. He breathed hard under her body, billows of hot steam rising in the process. The man's shoulders still moved erratically as with his heaving. As she noticed all this, a strange sense of loss struck Max. She looked up at the ceiling blankly, her eyelids shaking. What just happened? Why? Are you crying? Only after being questioned by the man did Max realize tears were falling from her lids. As she tried to hide her face in a hurry, she felt his moist tongue run over her cheek. She instantly tried to turn her face away. But this only led him to clasp her face and grasp it so that she wouldn't be able to escape him. "Don't avoid." An intense, incomprehensible gaze bore to her from his dark eyes, and it made goosebumps erupt on the skin of her back. As he said this, he placed his lips over her temples and cheekbones wet with tears. "You're my wife now. Like it or not, there's no turning back." Then he pulled her hair and forced a kiss. Repeatedly, she had to accept helplessly. Time passed without her knowledge. That fateful night, she couldn't count how many times they repeated it. After losing consciousness, she woke up past noon. By then he had already left for the expedition, and the nanny told her that the priest had identified the virgin blood on the bed and announced that their marriage was successful. Such was the rite of passage for marriage. That was all that happened between them. She lost her virginity to him, and he left for the Lexos Mountains on behalf of Duke Cross. Never had it occur to Max that they were a couple. She felt the same on this moment when they finally faced each other after years. Under the Oak Tree. Chapter 6. Max mustered her courage to look towards the man filled with eyes she could only fathom to be filled with enmity. Her father's voice echoed persistently in her ears like a haunting melody. "Make it clear to Calypso that you can't annul your marriage. Once again, if you insult the family, you'll pay heavily." But her lips only clung tightly to one another as if an invisible glue were applied on it. What should I say? To her, she was just another intimidating man but her husband. "Stop trembling." The man suddenly raised his voice, making her step away reflexively out of fear. As soon as her foot touched backward, the man came closer, his muscles visibly straining from tension. "Stop looking at me as if you've seen a disgusting thing. Am I some kind of despicable monster to you?" Riftan's words unexpectedly caught her off guard. I. Riftan cast her a fierce glance, only to sweep his hair a moment later from exasperation. Max's eyes dimmed. In less than 5 minutes of their reunion he was already displeased. And to think she still had to persuade him to reconsider a divorce. Her lips were trembling against her will. Please, just say something. She urged herself in silence. It's just. I'm so nervous. We don't know what to say. She could feel her cheeks burn and the unmistakable burning pain in her eyes that signaled her incoming tears. But she couldn't make him see that, to cry like a child in front of him. Desperation clawed at her immediately. I don't think why you are a monster, not a thought. I'm nervous. Yes. Trembling, stop. Her tongue didn't listen more than usual. She felt intense humiliation and couldn't bear to look him in the face anymore. It was too much of a feat in the first place. It was impossible for her to persuade him when she could not even speak properly. Max bowed her head instead, the blush from her cheeks traveling all the way to the tip of her ears. She might as well keep her mouth shut, she mused dismally. A mature woman wouldn't stutter like fool. In the end, she felt as if she were standing naked in front of him. Shit. Her shoulders flinched at the gentle voice that contrasted with the curse word. Her father was right, no man in the continent would ever want her as a wife. How could she even dare ask this man to refuse to marry a daughter of royalty, who was miles better than her? The helplessness that surged afterward did little to keep the tears at bay. At that moment, she felt the touch of cold skin on her cheek and was instantly frightened. A hand wearing the hard iron gloves used by the knights held her face with an uncanny tenderness. Open your mouth, he mumbled, almost too soft for her to hear. Max didn't understand what was going on and stared blankly at Riftan's dark eyes like night in front of her. The man sighed, as if his patience was being tested. Then he slightly lowered her chin, forcing her lips to part. Soon, he deftly moved his hot tongue inside her mouth. Max caught his arm in surprise, and she thought the man mumbled irritably because of it. He bit her lips, yet another startling remark coming from him. Fuck. I should have taken my armor off first. Max couldn't come to her senses, she was unable to understand what was happening out of the blue. Her thoughts still hazy, Riftan pushed her back. From where they were standing awkwardly, the next moment they were resting on sofa, with him stooping on one knee next to her thigh. With practiced ease, he flung his gauntlet off in one motion. His long, hard fingers that slipped out of the silver gloves softly wrapped around her face. Instinctively, she grabbed at him by the hem of his clothes. Without another second, he locked his lips with her again, taking off the gloves on his other hand. His now free hand wounded into her hair, his hot palm squeezing her head nearer him. His tongue scoured her mouth ferociously, not sparing her teeth or tongue from his onslaughts. With his every move, Max found herself out of breath. When she felt dizziness descend from the lack of oxygen, she finally pushed his chest out, and the man nibbled on her bottom lip. Just a little more. Her heart throbbed at his low voice. His hot hand once again pressing against the back of her back impatiently and moving past her face and neck to settle on her chest. As she twisted away in embarrassment, he pulled her back and made her lie on the sofa. Without the least hesitancy, he pulled her skirt down, exposing her skin to the cool air. Riftan, Max cried out. Having already experienced it one time, she was immediately aware of what his actions meant. Max stared at the door of the drawing room in puzzlement. She could only think fervently, what is he doing in broad daylight, in the drawing room of all places, where anyone can go in and out freely? But it seemed that the man didn't care about propriety at all. He dived for her neck in urgency, tracing kisses on her skin as he pressed his hardened body between her legs. Max let out a surprised shriek. Whenever the man slowly rubbed himself on her, his protective gear wrapped around his thick thighs grazed her legs, the touch of cool metal making her skin erupt in goosebumps. Max felt embarrassment at the intimacy she couldn't stand and shut her lids tightly. Suddenly, Riftan leapt up, hurriedly covering her almost nakedness with his large cloak. Only then did she realize that there was someone watching them. A man dressed like Riftan stood stiffly outside the door with a perplexed face. What are you peeking at like a rat? Riftan bellowed at once. Under the oak tree. Chapter 7. With Riftan's fiery cry, Max raised her head in a hurry. The man at the receiving end of his anger looked perplexed by his overbearing demeanor. He frowned and yelled back. How would I know someone was doing that inside the drawing room? I just didn't feel the need to knock, as I usually do, because the leader would notice me right away. Get the fuck out of here. She turned pale at her husband's cry. If he goes out, then what happens next? Max entreated the man with a look begging him not to leave from behind her husband's back. But the man merely gritted his teeth and muttered something harsh under his breath before turning away. I have got a carriage waiting outside. You said you weren't here to Oakle Cross Castle. Riftan replied without missing a beat, tell him to wait. The man gave a long, weary sigh, finding the situation helpless. Don't drag for long. He cast a disapproving glance at Max and shut the door behind him loudly and went away. Max's gaze drifted towards Riftan, roughly scratching his back and eyeing her with an intense look. His severe gaze made Max curl up and Riftan laughed sardonically at the sight. Don't shiver, I'm not going to rush at you again. Then he added after some pause, shit. I had no intention to attack here from the start. She didn't dare lift her head to look at him, but merely fixed her gaze on her fingers clasped together. He rose to his feet and straightened up his disheveled clothes. You heard that too, didn't you? There's a carriage waiting outside. We'll have to leave right away. She felt her skin cool, all the blood drained from her face. He was leaving her as quick as he came. She hadn't yet to say a word of persuasion, nor a coherent sentence. But. The panic-stricken Max couldn't even think of fixing her loose attire, rather, she grabbed the hem of his clothes in anguish. Wait a minute, let's talk. Riftan cut her off abruptly, we need to leave in a hurry. Have your maid get your luggage ready first. I'll hear what you have to say when we're in the carriage. Max, who was frightened to the point she trembled again, paused for a moment, confusion evident in her orbs. She asked him again with a puzzled look. And my baggage? Yes. Your things. Pack the things you need to bring, he spoke now in a soft tone, quite a difference from the bitter shouting from before. Still, Max felt his words were incomprehensible. She owlishly blinked at him, of which made him heave a great sigh. With quick hand gestures, he promptly arranged her unkempt dress and raised her from the sofa. He then called for a maid standing outside the door, ordering for Max's luggage. Only when she heard that did it dawn on Max he was taking her with him. She was struck with incredulity. Only get what you need. We can't be delayed further. Max bit out a reply immediately. Why yes, I won't pack anything else, maybe rice, but there's not much, only a few. Good. Then let's go. I'll provide the things you need upon arrival at my estate. The man called for the maid back with Max's luggage and had her lead them out of the drawing room. His long, hurried strides made Max almost run just to keep up with him. Meanwhile, Max was still with a befuddled mind. The situation was going to the outcome she had least unexpected. Why your estate? Why? He glared from over his shoulder and sarcastically said, is it strange that a poor, low-ranking knight would have his own territory? He added further, I was knighted, consecrated by King Reuben himself. With my last name as yours, you should have lived there after our marriage. Her puzzlement grew with every passing information. A house I should have been living in? Her thoughts unheard, he strode down the stairs in rapid steps and out into the wide garden, unwilling to explain further. Next to the cross-huge fountain, a luxurious carriage led by 4 horses was parked where a few knights gathered. As soon as they came up to them, the noise from the men clamored down. Some of the knights glanced at Max standing behind Riftan, their curious gazes almost leaving a hole on her face. At Max remaining still behind him, Riftan turned back. What are you still doing? Quickly get inside the carriage. But. Oh, my father should be waiting for me. Let's first. Riftan's face suddenly hardened. He grabbed her by the arm and dragged her all the way to the front of the carriage. You're my wife. I'm taking my wife with me, and whose permission should I head? Even your father has no power to interfere. With such decisive words, he lifted her inside with his robust arms and made her sit on the carriage seat. The mystified look from Max's face wouldn't leave. My wife, he said. And here she thought he was going to proceed with the divorce. Her thoughts were spiraling out of control inside her head. Under the Oak Tree. Chapter 8. Go, go, go. He sat opposite of her, shouting at the people outside of the carriage, and a moment later the wagon began to rattle. Max looked towards Castle Cross in bewilderment. She had imagined countless of times the different ways her reunion with her husband would have gone. However, this current development was far from the premeditated scenes in her anxious mind. Why? Why are you taking me with you? Max could only muse internally the question, looking at her husband with wide eyes like a doe. Riftan was looking out at the landscape with his arm over the window, looking remarkably calm, as if he had never dragged her out in a thunderbolt after he suddenly rained kisses on her. King Reuben has urged him to an engagement with his royal daughter. He won't miss this chance. The Duke of Cross was like the devil on her shoulder, repeating the damning words to her ear. But it was not only the Duke who thought so, even she believed in it. Princess Agnes, who was the royalty to be engaged to him, was a reputable magician, and one of the heroes who played a part in the excursion for the Red Dragon. The romantic story of the two similar souls who were fighting together on the battlefield and turning into lovers blew like a gentle wind throughout the city. Those who had caught whiff of this tale expected a grand wedding upon their return. The famous warrior, Riftan, and the gifted magician, Princess Agnes. And in her thoughts, she thought a divorce was imminent, spiraling down her like an unstoppable avalanche. Even the priest who had presided over their wedding would have thought so. Not a soul was unaware of how Duke Cross tyranny was the reason for their marriage. He had a legitimate cause and justification for demanding a divorce. But why did you? She stole a glance towards Riftan's side profile. The breeze that drifted into their carriage played with his locks, swaying them gently. His frosty countenance, one he must have developed after the severe expedition, served to create an unapproachable atmosphere. His untidy hair was even cluttered like a bird's nest on his forehead, and his burnt, golden skin gave his handsome appearance an even more exotic atmosphere. Max had never seen Princess Agnes in person, but she did heard tales of her great beauty. Brilliant, blonde locks and deep blue eyes like the ocean. She had no doubt that if she were to stand next to him, they would look like people from a beautiful painting. Thinking so, she took a cautious peek at her reflection on the carriage window. The sight of a wide forehead, the small, low bridge of her nose, and a face that to her looked weird because of her large eyes, greeted her. Brown freckles rested on the top of the nose like drizzled dirt, and her hair, which had been braided to control her rebellious curls, still had wayward hairs sticking out like straw. Only terrible thoughts were present inside her head. She was convinced he didn't want her to be his wife. There must be something else. What do you want me to do? She thought, at the receiving end of her fears. As if noticing her scrutinizing him, and the doubtful gaze from her eyes, he finally glanced back at her. Caught by his piercing eyes, Max quickly lowered her head. The man found her action disconcerting and spat out a small curse. Even though it feels terrible to be with me, try to hide your repulsion. I have no intention of leaving this carriage because of a faint-hearted wife. With his ever-increasing agitation, Max hurriedly said, "Oh, no, no. It's not terrible. No, I never said that." "In that case, what's with that look of disgust?" he venomously spat out a second later. In impulse, Max hurriedly raised her hands to cover her face. While it was true that confusion made her scared and jittery, she was belatedly mindful of how she must have looked to him with her depressing emotions on display. It must have made him feel unpleasant. "I know you are well aware how our situation," he gestured to both of them, "is not ordinary." The man sighed at her stubborn silence. Only unbeknownst to him, Max was sweating profusely in anxiety. He continued, more level-headedly this time, "I don't know much about you. I'm sure it's the same for you. But you're my wife now, and I must take you with me throughout my days, as the vows declare. But how can I regard you as my wife if you shiver so much just by being next to me? All your life. Why, you are taking me?" Her astonished look made his face distort. In fury or of something else, Max was already lost. "We got married 3 years ago. Isn't it the heaven's will for a married couple to live together forever?" She looked at him as if a second head had sprouted from his wide neck. She couldn't believe it. Such a person truly had no intention of breaking off their marriage? Perhaps he is lying for some reason. Maybe his words are to mock me because he thinks I haven't heard of his engagement to the princess. Despite his words, the thoughts in Max's head only proceeded to an abysmal path. Under the Oak Tree. Chapter 9. Even a native like me knows the importance of marriage vows. I can't believe that a noble lady like you ignored it thoroughly. He fired back at her in confusion. "What do you mean, ignore? What the hell do you call it? You married me and you completely ignored your duties so casually. Don't expect me to put up with such an attitude in the future." She opened her mouth in astonishment. How could he make such accusation? The day after their wedding, he left without saying a word. I didn't know. You didn't tell me." He seemed unimpressed with her defense, so she added, I never ignored, no. "Oh, rather, I've been waiting. Don't mess with me. You've stayed at your father's castle for the past 3 years, even though you're called Mrs. Calypso. You just chose to remain in your father's luxurious castle, despite knowing I had to leave my estate right after the wedding." He snorted loudly. "However, I seem to understand. No aristocratic woman in the world will give up her high position and protect her husband's house, who may return as a corpse." Max ran out of strength to answer, deeply embarrassed by his accusation that she couldn't refute a word. This man was just saying things he couldn't understand. But she couldn't let this go. This marriage, she was determined to save at all cost. "So," she said. Your house, how do I know about it? Where is it?" "Anything. You did not say anything. Don't play innocent. I did everything I could to get you to come and stay in my estate before I left for the army. When I die, you were supposed to inherit the estate that I was managing. The Duke's daughter may have no concern to me, but it was an important asset which you left it completely unattended." Anger was evident in his face. It didn't seem like he was faking a lie. He has no reason to deceive her in the first place anyway. Max could only swallow nervously. I didn't know, not a bit. My men said you refused to leave." He spoke bitterly, to which Max bowed her head in shame. "Don't bother acting sorry so suddenly. I've known what you think of me for the last 3 years." Riftan had always been aware of how everyone looked down on his status, a knight in the mercy of his superiors. And he was convinced that Maximilian felt just the same towards him. "Darn it, why are you suddenly talking this time? Do you think I'll beat you up if you don't? I am sorry. I really didn't know. When I woke up after our night together, you're already gone. I didn't hear any parting words from you." Riftan squinted his eyes at her, trying with all his might to see if she was indeed telling the truth. All the while, like a lamb to be slaughtered, Max waited for his next words, her heart beating rapidly against her chest. At the next moment, much to her surprise, the man spat out in a slightly softened tone. "Even if I didn't instruct you, you should have left for my estate. It is the natural duty of a married woman to spearhead her husband's house. This marriage might seem so small to you, but to me, it isn't." Max found no possible contradiction to what he said. Though she did not treat their marriage as trivial as what he was insinuating, it was true that she didn't take it so seriously and had only wanted to follow her father's orders. How come he took the marriage at heart? Their marriage was, after all, only an inevitable sacrifice for the sake of the Cross family. "What if you were pregnant?" "Pregnant?" Max, who was lost in her own thoughts, looked up at him nervously. "That night, I certainly fulfilled my duty enough. Isn't pregnancy a possible story?" The sarcasm that dripped from his mouth drained all colors from her face. Their intimate moment remained a painful and shameful memory to her. Even though she knew that the deed was for the purpose of establishing their marriage, she still felt uneasy whenever the memories of that night resurfaced to her mind. But he was making such light remarks as if it were no big deal to him. Max trembled in fear. However, her sudden change of demeanor didn't escape Riftan's notice, and he once again felt agitated at her reaction. He struck the wall with a loud bang. "Darn it, don't look like that. Like it's horrible to have my child." Max could only shiver in fear at his outburst. In the next second, far from his previous display of ire, Riftan assumed a calm state and became eerily silent. With quick movements, he suddenly put his hand on the carriage door, using it as a leverage, and jumped out of the running vehicle. Max screamed in surprise. "Sir! An ogre has been sighted!" one of his men cried from outside. Under the oak tree. Chapter 10. "I know. Put the shield around the carriage, now." After giving orders to someone, he looked back at her and cried sharply, "Never come out of the carriage." Then, he roughly closed the carriage door without waiting her answer. At that same moment, a deafening roar shook the earth. Maximilian covered her ears in defense to the monstrous sound. Every time the earth shook, the carriage wobbled under her feet. In a terrible shock and fear, she crouched to the floor and didn't dare look out the window. Recently, she heard vaguely that there were frequent sightings of monsters near her home, but it's been less than an hour since she left her father's castle. She closed her eyes tightly, her whole body trembling terribly. "Make it stop." She swallowed a sob. The carriage shook violently at the end of someone's cry. Then came the roars of beasts and shouts of knights which almost sounded inhumane and barbaric to her ears. Overwhelmed by the sudden shift in events, she buried her face deep in her bulbous skirt. Around her, continuous dull sounds that seemed to collide with something resonated. What could that be? Hesitantly, she raised her head slowly in fear that of hitting carriage ceiling and was greeted with a sight that would surely haunt her for life: huge, bloodshot, Green eyes were staring at her from the window. In reflex, she screamed and stood close to the other side. But it was too late. Her small body flipped in the air, her world turning upside down as the carriage lost its balance. She screamed at the top of her lungs and tried to reach the opposite carriage wall where the door was located. But just couldn't. Then, the vehicle jolted to the opposite direction and Max was flung towards the now wide-open door. And in no time, she found herself kissing the ground, the rocks digging in her skin. In the face of danger, Max became ghastly pale, thoroughly shaken of being out of her safe haven. With little strength she could muster, she scrambled back up to the carriage, but her legs seemed to not work, her body, overwhelmed by the turn of events, became weak and numb. She looked around for help. But everyone was busy fighting the grey giants. Eventually, she crawled on her knees and tried to climb up the carriage on her own. As she did so, one ogre caught sight of her and started creeping nearer the damsel in distress. Heavy foot thumping became louder and clearer. Upon realization, Max screamed out loud, her throat hurt. This scream added fuel to the fire as the giant started advancing faster. Before the monster could reach her, a flash of light flashed across her eyes and the giant's body fell to the ground in a loud, earth-shattering thud. "Madam, get inside now. There's a shield here where it's safe." She looked back abruptly on her shoulder and saw a man of slender build, calling her attention. "This is an ogre from the mountain. Don't worry, nothing wrong will happen to Lord Calypso. Stay inside." "Oh, I didn't mean to come out." Max groaned out in panic. Riftan's order to not to come out of the carriage echoed in her mind. She didn't mean to disturb the men at all. "Madam, go inside. Please." The man broke off to his gibberish. She wanted to tell him what happened, but it was not the time to be making excuses. Instead, she willed herself to climb up the carriage with a wobbly gait, when she heard another thud. Unconsciously turning her head to the source of sound, Max saw blood sprouting from the gushing cut at the giant's upper body, which spurted blood like a fountain. Her stomach, which had been strained for the past few days, twisted painfully. She tried to hold back the bile rising up her throat, but to no avail. She ended up emptying her stomach to the ground unabashedly. The enormity of the sight she had just seen making her vomit on the very spot she stood. "Madam Calypso!" the man shouted in surprise. She clawed at her neck desperately, her eyes welling up tears in pain. "Are you all right?" Gasping for breath, she tried to find comfort at the touch on her back, but the nausea that started once was hard to stop. "What's going on?" A familiar voice reached her ears. Max raised her head at the startled voice of Riftan. He stood by the giant's body, looking at her worriedly. Instinctively, Max crept backwards, the bloodied appearance of her husband frightening her. As he strode closer, dark red spots of blood taints the ground his feet touches. The sharp sword which shone blue was now scarlet red, and the silver-white armor became ink dark with thick, black blood of the giant all over it. He looked as horrible as a lion in hell. Max backed off, lost her balance and stumbled towards the carriage wall. In her sight, his figure shook like a hazy dream and soon became strangely distorted. She felt dizzy. Slowly, everything was devoured by darkness, and the sounds surrounding her faded away. And before she knew it, she sank deep into unconsciousness. Under the Oak Tree. Chapter 11. The fall of the Rome Empire, which seized power over the West Territory and soon controlled all the way to the south, has brought an era of emperors to the continent. The empire was torn into 7 pieces: Wheaton, Baldo, Dristan, Osiria, Suecan, Arich, and Libadon. Emperors from each country struggled to gain the loyalty of the service members to protect their territory. The nobles had to strive to have more knights and wizards of their own accord. Maximilian's father, Duke of Qua, was no exception. The first Duke of Qua was one of the emperors of Wheaton who succeeded in taking over Okdo, a rich land of Dristan, formerly owned by royal family members of the Rome Empire. The Duke of Qua fought dozens of wars across generations to get his hands on a vast granary and tens of thousands of serfs, whom he could very well take advantage of, in the land he seized. Then, 30 years ago, the 7 countries signed a ceasefire agreement to counter the exponential increase in lynching, putting pressure on the Duke to return the stolen land to Dristan. The Duke of Qua, who already lost about half of his territory, opened his eyes to every solution and soon found one. It was to marry a noble lady from the Rome family to gain the legitimacy of his land control. He found a Rome virgin and succeeded in marrying her. She was Arian Rome Gorda. At the time of their marriage, the Duke of Qua was very pleased with his marriage. Arian was a chaste maiden with beautiful features, obedient, gentle, and, above all, she was a direct descendant of the royal family, who once ruled the entire continent. Hence, the Duke, who was freed from the land dispute by marrying her, was deeply contented. He couldn't ask for a more suitable match. But not long after, he was faced with just another problem. It was the issue of successors. Like all noble men, the Duke of Kwa was also fiercely longing for his heir to inherit his title, vast territory, and his precious castle of Kwa. But for almost 6 years into marriage, Arian remained fruitless, much to his disappointment. Multiple times did she get pregnant, and multiple times was the couple devastated with the miscarriages that followed. Under such circumstances, the Duke's anxiety was beyond description. Although he has made every effort to secure a healthy heir to his wealth, he had experienced only frustration for 10 lengthy years. Finally, a healthy child was born, perhaps because of his devotion to God, or so what he claimed. Unfortunately, the baby was a girl. The despondency felt by the Duke when he found out about it was immeasurable. By the time the baby was 3 or 4 years old, he was filled with rage. The useless girl couldn't even be on a horseback. By the time his daughter grew up, he gave up the slightest hope that she would marry to one of the bachelors of the royal family of Wheaton and get a successor in between. Yet, his daughter had a problem with her speech, a trait he feared would be inherited by her son. A disabled man could not be counted as heir to the Kwa family. He firmly believed that only a healthy boy with no faults would protect his family's honor. However, Arian was unable to give birth to a son until her last breath. She died of exhaustion and complications due to her frequent miscarriages. The Duke, who was desperate of a successor, immediately greeted a new bride among Arian's cousins. Yet, odds remained against him, for after a short time, his second wife died of a disease, leaving him another daughter. Not only that, rumors that the Kwa family was cursed, hence causing his wife's early demise, started to spread in the continent. This made the Rome family refuse to him another bride. In the long run, the Duke of Kwa had no choice but to put all his hopes and expectations on his second daughter, Rosetta Kwa. Fortunately, Rosetta, unlike her first daughter Maximilian, had beautiful features, wit and outstanding skills. If she was married to a reputable family and produce an heir, she could retain control over his vast territory while continuing the superior lineage of the Kwa family. To achieve that end, the Duke spared no pains. Excellent tutors, hundreds of servants, beautiful clothes, jewelry. He gave whatever Rosetta wanted, anything to make her the most perfect bride in Wheaton. While he gave extra pampering to his younger daughter, he couldn't afford to bat an eye towards his first daughter, who was not all useful. Hence, Maximilian was always on the back burner. No, it would have been better if he had just treated her as a total stranger. But this was not entirely the case. Under the Oak Tree. Chapter 12. From some point on, he came to regard the existence of his first daughter, Maximilian, as an eyesore. In the aristocratic society, many families were reluctant to associate with cursed people. There were even some people who refused to get close to any member of the Kwa family, fearing that they too would be cursed just by being within a close proximity. In fact, eligible men refused to marry Rosetta, thinking they may be born with a defective child. This issue drove the Duke to anger and incorrigible resentment. He even thought that he would die out of frustration. For the first time in his life, he suffered this massive setback. For the first time in his life, he had a useless daughter who always succeeded in bringing shame and frustration to the family. Alongside the child's growth into womanhood, his anger also grew paramount. And he projected his frustrations on her without mercy. Hitting her flesh until it swells to teach her manners, shaming her in front of others for spilling her porridge clumsily, the Duke never forgave even the slightest fault. Her imperfection was the imperfection of the family. They had to be extra cautious with their actions and do all means to uplift their reputation. All of these became the fault of the immature Maximilian. And through this belief, his father's actions were justified. She's a flaw that couldn't be fixed. Her existence, nothing but a mistake. Everyone believed that the family was better off without her, that she should have not been born in the first place. Maximilian grew up hearing all of these in her entire life. Her father never called her by her name. With her father's beating, underneath his disdainful gaze, her character crumpled to pieces. Resigned to her heart, she succumbed to the judgments hurled at her, and slowly embodied the Maximilian that no one wanted. Max. Wake up. She opened her eyes to quite a stirring, a strong hand shaking her shoulders. From under his nose, Riftan's dark eyes stared down at her. She glanced back blankly, unable to grasp the situation quickly. But by the moment he swept the hair on her forehead behind her ears, Max immediately came to her senses, the intimate action pulling her from her stupor. She hurried to her feet and looked around. Is this? This is an inn. Remember when we were in a carriage and attacked by ogres? You fainted. While you were unconscious, we slipped through the forest and stumbled on this village nearby the roads. He answered with a big pillow in his hand, which he stuffed behind Max so she could sit upright comfortably. She buried herself in the cushion and looked up at him with a puzzled look. He poured water into the bowl on the table. Drink. You kept sweating. You have to replenish the water in your body. When Max only stared dumbfoundedly at the water, he frowned and hurried. Do you think that I put poison in this? Don't be ridiculous. Drink quickly. She took the bowl right away and drank its contents. Her stomach felt a little nauseous when the lukewarm water got into her insides. The man raised one eyebrow when he put the bowl down with a frown. Are you uncomfortable with anything? Oh, no. Let me know if you feel any pain. I'll call in a physician. No. I feel fine. The man soon walked toward the table with a bowl of water. When he stepped back away from her sight, she was able to see the whole view of the room, the place no longer obscured by his body. It was a shabby room. The walls and floor were all made of wood, and the only thing in the fairly spacious chamber was a bed, a table, and a couple of rickety chairs. Above her, she studied the ceiling carefully, in case there was a spider. Surely, a spider's web glistened faintly within the reach of light. Fortunately, the bed was clean. Max tentatively sniffed the soft blankets which smelled like mildew, and suddenly frowned. Something feels strange. She slipped her hand inside the thick blankets which covered her legs. Reaching beneath, she felt her smooth bare legs. Only then did she realize that she was wearing a man's tunic. She was not even wearing any underwear. This is, oh my clothes. Riftan, who was immersed in arranging the towels, picked the bowl of water from the table, glanced at her once and replied nonchalantly. He found the matter insignificant. I took it off. You threw up and got dirtied. What you are wearing is my tunic. In haste, we failed to bring with us your suit of clothes, so I had to dress you with my spare. She patted like a carp, unable to figure out whether she should be dumbfounded or shocked at the fact that he undressed her while she was unconscious. You've been unconscious all day and haven't eaten. I should go out and fetch you some food. As soon as the man went out the door with a grave look on his face, Max quickly rummaged for something to wear underneath. Nothing in the room that could be presumed as a suitcase was found. Instead, there was only the armor he had taken off casually piled by the bed. While she determinedly searched for something she could use, the blanket was peeled off from her body, therefore exposing some of her skin. In cue, the door rattled and Riftan's head bobbed in as he returned to the room to check on her. Like a deer caught in the headlights, she looked at him with stunned, round eyes and hurriedly grabbed the blanket tightly, wrapping it around her body once more. It's no use trying to hide it now. I saw it all while wiping your body. You cleaned me up yourself? Under the Oak Tree. Chapter 13. When asked back in a shrill voice, his lips cynically twisted into a sneer. I told you, you're my wife. We consummated 3 years ago. Why are you acting like that? Max glowed red from her head to toe. Ashamed, her face became visibly hot at once, her hands fidgeting at her sides. Darn it, do not freak out, I just changed your clothes. You should have fainted on the night of our wedding if you abhorred the very thought of me touching you. Her shoulders shook, her mind in a terrible shamble. Gravely enraged, Riftan spewed out these words, a corrupted noblewoman is frustrated, losing her mind even, by things as trivial as this. Max blushed and muttered in a muted voice. I'm sorry. Her apology was returned by his silence. After a short moment, Max heard the hinges of a closing door as Riftan went out to the road. And she found herself alone with only the cold walls of the shabby room to keep her company. She shook her head in disappointment. How many times have she made him upset today? An entire had yet to pass since they had reunited hours ago. Is it okay to let him be like this? Max bit her lip nervously. Riftan now treats her as a wife, but there was no guarantee that this would last. No, it was only a matter of time before he comes to his senses. The very thought of a divorce haunted her, making her loathe herself even more. What if he realizes that I'm useless? He'll certainly take a harsher attitude towards me. Riftan was a knight who, out of scratch, made a name for himself. Now that he was already with a high position, he would naturally be invited to numerous social gatherings and banquets in the future. At this thought, Max sighed, thoroughly disheartened. She knew well that she was not the kind of wife a husband would want to boast around. I'm sure he will realize this soon enough and start abusing me. Just like my father. Why don't I just go home and ask for my father's mercy before it happens? She recalled him standing tall, clutching his sword by its hilt. He cut a monster 3 times his size in one stroke. It was terrible to imagine what would happen if he wielded a whip against her. This possible scenario made her squirm anxiously. But he hasn't hit me yet. She gathered her brows at this musing. He didn't raise his hand against her even after becoming irritated with her many times. Maybe he is not as cruel as his father. On a second note, they have just been reunited. There was no telling what will happen next. She was pondering on these possibilities when she heard a rattle of the door. Riftan came back to the room with a tray of steaming bread and soup. It's a bread made of vegetable soup and barley. Try to eat before going back to sleep. We're going to stay at this inn tonight and leave tomorrow as soon as the sun comes up. He put the tray down on the bedside shelf and said so. Max blinked her eyes. He went out in a rage and came back with food as if nothing had happened. This man is unpredictable. What are you idling about? Eat it before it gets cold. In haste, she took the bowl of soup and a wooden spoon in her hand. Thank you. I'll eat well. Max stirred the soup, blew it, and put it in her mouth. It was a little hot, but it wasn't enough to leave blisters on her tongue. Truthfully, she didn't have much appetite, but still, she managed to push in a few spoonfuls of the savory soup, which made her feel a bit better. After a minute, she put down her spoon and couldn't help but glance at the man. He was dragging a chair by the bed and started grooming his sword. He looked 2 or 3 years younger than his actual age. What are you looking at? Why aren't you eating? Does the back of his head have eyes? She blushed at the thought of him catching her peeking. I want to change. Looking around, she added, I don't see my clothes anywhere. He turned around as he hesitated to open his mouth, stirring the soup with a spoon. Now that it's late, just go to bed. I'll buy you a new one tomorrow. My clothes. I asked the maid who works at this inn to wash it. He spoke calmly, the reflection of his face visible in the sword he was cleaning so thoroughly. She hesitated for a long time and then spoke again. My underwear. Give it back. At that moment, the man's face became incredibly red. He rubbed his palms roughly around his mouth, and then answered calmly. It's torn apart. Under the oak tree. Chapter 14. What? I stripped it off of you and had torn it in the process. Oh, how? Did you, take it off? Max could not help but ask back. The question sounded a little disconcerting to him. Turning his seat around, he faced her and watched her figure clutch the sheet like a shield, and then shouted. What am I supposed to do? You couldn't breathe because you were turning blue even, due to your drawers. I was trying to untie the knot because the terrible underwear was too tight. No matter how hard I tried, the knot didn't come loose, so I ripped it off. Damn it. I didn't even know it could be taken up and down. Maximilian's face reddened to the point of steaming. She was mortified to death, thinking that he had seen her underwear, and the flesh beneath it. Her nanny forcibly made her wear tight drawers in her husband's absence. She said it would keep her chaste. Max was forced to wear that horrible thing on her body, but she never dreamed that someone would see it. As she clasped her face in an impulse to jump out of the window immediately, Riftan said with a small sigh. I'll get you a new underwear tomorrow, so don't look like that. Or do you want me to lend you mine? Oh, no. It's okay. Max shook her head fervently. She didn't have the slightest intention of wearing other person's underwear, or a man's for that matter. Besides, wearing only one loose-fitting men's tunic already made her feel unease. Riftan scanned her eyes and watched her rummage through the soup with her spoon. When will you finish stirring that? Hurry up and eat. You didn't even touch the bread. She popped a few more spoonfuls into her mouth. However, the short mouth of her original body and her bulging stomach made her lose her appetite soon. She didn't even think of touching the hard bread, only swallowing a little more soup, and then putting the bowl aside. What? You haven't eaten half of it, Riftan started. I have no appetite, so. Don't be so hard on me. You can't dream of luxurious food until we get home. Even if it doesn't suit your taste, your body won't hold out if you don't tolerate it. Max blushed at the sound of him akin to admonishing a spoiled child. Or are you going to be so picky and annoying throughout the journey? He added irritably. I'll have. She ended up having a few more sips but was so sick that she couldn't eat anymore. The man made a disjointed expression when she put the spoon down. Fortunately, however, instead of forcing her to eat more, he sighed and accepted the tray with the bowl. "You are going to go bald if you keep being picky." He clicked his tongue and turned around. Max shrugged her shoulders, unable to adapt to his constantly changing mood like unreliable weather. He seemed kind enough to take care of her meal, but then he would quickly get angry the next moment. Are my words and actions so incriminating? She felt that inside, he may already be regretting bringing her with him. Why would he? Some negative and servile thoughts filled her head. Max, who looked at his eyes, couldn't stand it any longer and uttered the question on impulse. "Well, why are you taking me away?" "What?" The man, who was going out with the bowl, paused and looked back at her. "What does that mean?" "Well, against me, getting married." Ha, you did it because you wanted to do it." "Oh, you didn't. Why are you taking me with you?" I don't understand." His face became visibly stiff. She swallowed hard. It was hard to tell whether the stuttering was causing a bad impression on him or her own question was upsetting. Although filled with hesitancy, she still added, "In the first place, no. You and I are both rich married couples, you're too better for me. We barely know each other. That and you're taking me somewhere, but as much as you like." "Shut the bullshit." Riftan let out a sudden roar, staring furiously at her. He laid down the tray and strode back to the bed. "Be honest. Don't you want to come with me?" That's not what it is. No, it's not. Although it's not huge as your father's, my castle is big enough for a little girl like you to live. Damn it, I have enough money. If you're worried that you won't be able to live in luxury like you used to, cut it out." She shrank like a child scolded. Why on earth does he think she worries about living like royalty when she has lived a poor life all along at her father's castle? She answered in a flurry of words and desperately waved her hands, as if the mere action would erase her former statements. "No. That sort of thing doesn't worry me. It's just. Why are you taking me? I'm only curious. Naturally, you are my wife. Our marriage is real, officially recognized by the church. It's only common sense to take you to my house. You did wrong by living at your father's house even after you got married." But I thought you would want a divorce." "What?" He clasped his hands sternly on her shoulders. Max turned blue like a mouse in front of a snake. The anger on his face suffocated her. Perhaps this was where violence, one stemmed from the impatience of understanding a stutter, would ensue. She closed her eyes with fear, as she always did when the Duke of Cross beat her. But no matter how long she waited, pain did not come. When she opened her eyes, she was greeted with his dark orbs glaring fiercely at her. His hands, holding onto her shoulders, were trembling faintly, as he managed to control his simmering anger. "Divorce? You want to divorce me now?" Under the Oak Tree. Chapter 15. "Oh, no. That's not. If not, what the hell is it? Is there someone else?" It took a while for Max to grasp the meaning behind his words. For a few moments, the stupefied her just stared into his burning eyes. Unfortunately, her silence was misconstrued. Riftan got the wrong idea. With snarl in his tone, he spoke contemptuously. "There I was battling to death, and here you are with another man? Oh, no. Oh, I didn't." Her answer in almost a crawling hesitation, slightly robbed him of his strength. Still unconvinced, he fiercely rammed his queries into her. "Then why on earth are you talking about divorce? When you came back, I thought you would ask for a divorce and marry her. So. Her?" After a moment's thought, he added sharply, hoping he'd managed to comprehend her ramblings. "Agnes?" At the mention of the name, Max's eyes widened. A forlorn nod was the only response she could manage. But the man before her, with a deadpan face, spat out a volley of curses and roughly rubbed his head, seemingly miffed. A bunch of foolish humans spreading a bunch of useless rumors. He muttered to himself. He walked over and sat on her bed. After a brief moment, he casually and with ease, put her on his lap. His abrupt actions caught Maximilian by surprise. Reflexively, she fluttered her legs to a close. Riftan gently and affectionately held her face in both his hands and drew closer. The next thing that a muddled Max felt was his moist tongue licking the moisture from her eyes. Her lashes fluttered and she closed her eyes. He was in no rush, brushing away those tears, one drop at a time. His hot breath tickled her cheeks, her lips quivered in response, pulse raced. Instinctively, she let out a soft whimper. Sensing her weary and shaken form, Riftan breathed out a deep sigh and wound an arm around her waist. I don't know what you've heard, but I turned down the offer. You refused? Her eyes opened wide with astonishment, his voice scaled up a note. You bet. Do you think I would accept such a crazy offer? What does he mean crazy offer? How is it crazy to offer a beautiful princess to a warrior who saved the world? Who in a sane mind would propose a marriage to a married man in the first place? When I heard that story, I thought this king was crazy. But if anyone changes his sacred vows before God, I'll castrate him with my own hands. How could you think I would do such an unethical thing? Is he serious? She looked up at him, astonished and embarrassed at the same time. She had often heard that knights valued faith, but did this man have faith in chivalry too? He kicked away the golden chance to become a part of a royal family for a forced marriage with her. Marrying a royalty would have given him a new title, a royal honor and a huge dowry. And it didn't end at just that. His son would naturally have the right to the throne. Hence, it was only natural that his wife, who could not give him what Agnes could, surmised his decision as pure madness. This guy. He's out of his mind. Only then did she realize that this man was taking their vows seriously and had every intention to honor it. Most of all, he was without an ulterior motive. In his words, he was only taking her because he considered her as his wife. Max floundered in the shock and clenched her teeth in disbelief. But is this person sane? Perhaps, he knows not what he has missed. Forgetting her current situation, as she was deeply engaged in their conversation, she daringly countered. Well, really. But, it's okay. Oh, Agnes is a very, very beautiful woman, rich woman. Have you ever met Agnes? She flinched. Was she too hasty in calling his refusal in a single-stroke madness? In person, I've never met her, but how do you know if she's beautiful or not? I don't like a mad woman, a colt tailing after me. Is it okay to talk about the royal family as such? Max looked up at him, her face full of puzzlement. Just then Riftan suddenly raised his hand. She was taken aback, nevertheless still waited for his hand to strike. But it did not. Instead the thumb wiped away the remnant tears off her cheeks. Forget that ridiculous rumor. In the first place, life in the palace does not suit me. I don't want to live in the princess' big-ass place. But. Enough with that but. Are the rumors just an excuse and you're really unhappy with this marriage? A dangerous glint shone in the man's eyes. She shook her head hurriedly, his face straightened out again. That's enough already. If you bring up this nonsense again, I won't tolerate it the next time. She widened her eyes. You put up with it? What are you talking about? While she was grumbling to herself, she suddenly felt the man's hand touch the small of her back. It gradually started to explore. Instinctively, she stiffened. His hand slowly made its way down and dug under the sheets that covered her. Under the oak tree. Chapter 16. Only then did Max realize again that she was wearing only a thin piece of clothing around her otherwise naked body. She trembled, not from the cold that blanketed the chamber, but from his heated gaze solely trained upon her. Lifting her hips slightly, he pulled out the sheets from beneath and carelessly tossed them to the floor. Max hurriedly pulled the tunic down and struggled to cover her legs. To no avail, he simply pushed up the hem of her dress and grabbed her chest in a way that would foil her effort in dismissing his actions. She let out a high-pitched scream. Ick. The feeling of hot, rough hands touching her soft skin was indescribably quaint and intense. Stop that noise. You don't even know your husband's name, do you? The man who was rubbing his nose against the delicate skin of her neck raised his head and gave a dissatisfied look. Max just blinked her eyes like an owl. She quivered, and through the corners of her eyes saw his head descend. In a split second, Riftan kissed her, his lips unbelievably hot and soft, a stark contrast to the harsh and violent words he uttered. Don't be so embarrassed. Our marriage wasn't normal, as you said, but it was inevitable. Now you have to get used to me. A hot, hard finger swept the hair over her forehead. The unexpected soft action embarrassed her. His lips constantly touched her cheeks, temples and earlobe. Stony thighs wriggled under her hips while his hot breath taunted her neck. He grabbed the hem of her dress. Max closed her eyes. She had already experienced this and knew what was to follow. More than anything else, she was aware of how painful it would be. Sensing her taut body, he gave a small sigh. Relieve the tension, it will only hurt you. But this is not our first time. The man, who had been biting the lower part of her neck, hesitated for a moment and asked, "No?" Her lips drew out a tight smile as she looked into his eyes. Max couldn't bring herself to say no. After all, Riftan refused to seal his relationship with the royal family to keep his marriage vows. As such, how could she refuse her husband in the bedroom? Shaking her head after much hesitation, Max gave her consent. Not letting any more time slip from his hands, Riftan pushed his tongue deep into her mouth, as if he thirsted, tasting her in every corner. She inadvertently put her hands on his pectoral muscles, her fingers cowered away in surprise at the heavy thumping it emanated. His salive-soaked lips sprinkled small kisses on the tip of her chin, then slowly descended on her neck, lingering on the clavicle for a while. His ragged breaths and the moist feel of his tongue made the hairs on her back stand. "Raise your arms." She raised her arm in a stiff motion and felt him strip her clothes over her head. The cold air nipped at her bare skin and Max covered her chest in a fit of embarrassment, hugging her herself tightly. To make her comfortable, Riftan rained kisses on her shoulder. "I'll make it as smooth as possible." She looked up at him with trembling eyes. The man's eyes then went down greedily. She followed his gaze and looked down at herself under the light. Round chests, flat abdomen, pale, white thighs, and her tender spot in between. She felt more sensitive to the naked sight of his fingers touching her mounds. He playfully bit her clavicle and sucked her chest. Max gasped. She could feel his wet tongue draw circles on her skin. The strange sensation sent a thrilling shudder from her neck to her ears. Hey, wait a minute. Riftan," he grunted. He sucked her chest painfully, as if he was punishing her. Max gave a small shriek. He released her hands from his hold and let her wrap them around his neck. The heat she felt from his body and the soft texture of his hair made her feel sick to her stomach. "Call me Riftan." "Oh, hey. Call me," he ordered softly. In a quivering voice, she spoke, Riftan." Upon hearing so, his shoulders jerked up and down. The man gruffly muttered his incoherent words, then raised his head and kissed her fiercely. His hot, muscular arms tightened, as if to break her waist. The first passion she experienced, she gasped and unwittingly clung to his neck. A nimble smile gradually rose on her lips. "Yes, hold on to me tightly like that." While he was enthralled by her first smile, he held her head in one hand and kissed her passionately. His other hand gently stroked her lower abdomen and deftly maneuvered between her legs. Aware of his intrusive actions, Max hurriedly squeezed her thighs to a close, but could not stop his hand that had already reached its desired destination. He moved his fingers carefully. At the same time, Max flinched at the sensation of an unmistakable prick against her stomach. Under the oak tree. Chapter 17. Beautiful. Riftan stared at her flushed face and whispered in breathless wonder. That alone changed his impression beyond recognition. His sharp eyes thinned, beautifully bent, and his firm lips loosened softly, making him look like an innocent boy. He moved his shapely lips over her own lips, and strummed his fingers delicately like a minstrel who played the flute. The wet sounds that echoed even reddened the Max to her ears. And a strange sensation began to simmer, making her toes curl. Unconsciously trying to evade his hands, he began to exert pressure. Ah! It felt like flashes of sparks from the bottom of her toes flew to the top of her head inside her. Max clung desperately to his shoulder as his thick chest convulsed with laughter. "You feel good when I touch this place, don't you?" "Oh, no. I don't." Suddenly she was struck with panic. Her voice was so strange that she couldn't think of it as her own. Her heart beating furiously and racked with an unfamiliar, intense feeling of her limbs weakening, Max buried her lips on his shoulder, desperately swallowing a piercing moan. As the man persistently tormented her, the heat boiled inside her body and swelled beyond her control. Max gasped and buckled underneath him, her stomach felt as if it was melting. Stop. Oh. It's all right. Just keep feeling it." He continued to torture without hesitation. "Feel it? What are you even doing?" Max's lips quivered in confusion. But his hands only moved faster and faster. Soon, something bubbled up from below and exploded violently. The pulses of electric shock made her release a scream enough to make one's hair stand on end. As she tried to escape, he hugged her swaying body. Max trembled helplessly and rubbed her damp forehead against his neck. Her body twisted beyond her consciousness and her legs trembled. She could feel her heartbeat, hear it even. Riftan only drew in a violent breath. "Damn it, I only thought about this. I touch you and you're all over me. I only wanted to think of this in that hellish place. He pursed his lips and began to stimulate again where she was still trembling in the clouds. She sobbed and shook her head wildly. But she could not escape from it. He traced her earlobes and pushed his finger into her wet entrance, the delicate muscles contracting upon the intrusion of the foreign substance. A low groan instantly came from the lips that were wandering around her ears. Do you know how soft it is here? How warm it is? His voice gradually turned into a murmur, fingers crawling out, agonizingly slow, and pushed again deeply, filling her to the brim. Although it was a little bit bitter and uncomfortable, it didn't hurt as much as she remembered. Did she recall what happened that day because she exaggerated it in her mind too much? She had never experienced a mix of soft, hot and intense sensations together. As she was thinking, her head hazy, Riftan gently rolled the moist flesh with his thumb. He ran his fingers through her depths, and traced his lips down the nape of her neck. Max struggled to get used to the peculiar feeling of ecstasy, as if she had fallen into another world. Yesterday alone, she was so scared and awkward when she allowed him to touch her. Everything was quite unreal. Yet, why can't she feel bad about it? Just relax a little bit more. Oh, it hurts. Listen. It won't hurt when I go in if you do it like this. When I go in. Shocked by the words, she soon turned white as his slow-moving fingers continued their ministration. She squeezed her legs together and breathed hard on his shoulder. But he only whispered passionately, still kissing her temples, forehead and eyelids without rest. I'll show you how. Just relax a little bit. She shook her head in confusion and unconsciously grasped the back of his head as he pushed his fingers deeper. She let out a low groan, her eyelids fluttering. I can't. I don't. No. Breathe long, breathe. Ease down and let it go. She breathed out long as he told her to. Then she felt her body finally relax slowly. He kept his gentle strokes inside her, all the while pressing his lips against her cheeks telling her she did well. Tighten slowly this time, with all your strength. He pressed a part of her warm walls and rubbed it as if he were trying to tell her where it was. Unintentionally, she curled her bottom and tightened on his fingers. He laughed in mirth again. I'm going crazy. No. You're doing great. Try to relax again. Yes, like that. She gasped and relaxed, as she had been taught, and when he came in and went out, she tightened on him as if she was holding him back. Driving me crazy. Nothing he said went into her ears as her part carried on the strange exercise he taught. With every second, hot heat gradually rose from inside her body. It came like a slow wave, but the crash came violent. Max's legs shook, her back arched, and then she felt something explode inside her a second time. Under the oak tree. Chapter 18. Max pressed her face against his shoulder and waited for the intense feeling to pass. Her hips quivered, something warm trickling down between her legs. Good job. You did very well, he murmured to her, as if soothing a child. She felt limp on the bed sheets, unable to get out of the peak in the clouds. He quickly threw his clothes over his head and rose from the bed. She was certain it wasn't the first time she has seen it, but the moment she saw his body shining in the dark so sensibly, a thin shiver broke from her chest. The beauty of the man before her penetrated her heart. Hold me. He quickly returned to the bed and prostrated himself on her body. Something began to slowly brush against her thighs and closer to her petals. She clasped her arms around his neck, his hot, beating body weighing heavily on her own. Such a strange feeling was prevalent. Is the act now and before truly the same? She thought. The warm length entering her inside still felt uncomfortable like the first time, but it wasn't as painful as she remembered. Just a little more, he mumbled, stroking her back. The flickering light at the bedside cast a shadow over his face, where beads of sweat on the man's forehead flowed down his cheeks like pearls and on the tip of his chin. The beads glistened on his smooth, golden skin ethereally. She unwittingly reached out and touched it, and the man's eyes shook. Fuck. He sank heavily in one, fluid motion, the audible slap of his body against hers catching Max by surprise. Breathless by the sudden pressure, she twisted and tightened around him. A painful groan came out of his mouth. Fuck. Don't give me strength. I'm sorry. She looked up at him with eyes to the point of tearing. She felt like a clay dough being molded to him, being fitted into his shape as she tried to wriggle around. Was it even acceptable to feel someone this close? Their rough breathing, heavy heartbeats, searing temperatures of their damp skin. She couldn't tell which was his and which was hers. The only thing Max felt in that moment was as if his and her body were being morphed into one. I feel so good. Riftan groaned as he drew closer, deeper down her moist walls, the sweat drops on his shoulders dribbling down his chest and onto her body. Max looked up with trembling eyes at his scary, hardened face. At first glance, she saw the creases of his brows as if bearing pain, and she could only think, is it really good? Feel good? When the question went out of her lips, the man's mouth twisted into laughter. Why do you think I'm holding on to a woman doing this until I pass out today? He grasped her hip, stretching her legs for better access, and moved forward forcefully. As the feeling of a hot, pulsating, mass of flesh slithered down again inside, she uttered a painful sound, her mouth wide open. Whenever his body went out, she breathed, and when he pushed back again, she tried to remain calm. Riftan murmured in a strained voice, exhaling a short breath. I'm like a lunatic. I didn't mean to do this. I was just going to let you rest. But you in your underwear. Oh. His hard stomach weighed down on her heavily, as their bodies found intimate contact between other. Hot flesh against flesh. Max's fingernails had long found their way on his back to scratch his skin in an unconscious effort to stifle the pleasure within. I'm trying to endure. I did. What he was saying was no longer passed through her ears. Her body was the captain of her feelings. His gestures, the rough waves become more unraveling, harsher, pushing her sideways. It had come to the point it impossible for her to know when she should relax and renew her strength. Her body turned stiff with her inability to keep up with his mercurial movements. He picked up speed, driving her to the point of no return, and winded Max's legs to tremble beneath him. Maxie. He purred, her eyes were barely opened as she peered up at him. As she felt his big hand clasp her cheek, she thought, why are you calling me that way? Her heart skipping a beat at the solemnness on his face. For a moment, he felt like a close confidant. The man wrapped his hands around her face and kissed her frantically as their bodies molded to one. She felt his huge body shaking like a stallion, stiffening. A man who couldn't take it anymore, yet, was still persistent to have more. As he reached his peak, his hold on her legs becoming more forceful with his ravenous thrusts, delicious warmth suddenly filled her lower region. Tingles traveled from all over her body, a sensation she had experienced a second time but still not finding it quite familiar. Drowned in a daze of ecstasy, her fists unwittingly weakened, turning to an embrace on his sweaty back as he drooped over her with his raspy breath. She could feel his heart throb as fast as hers against her skin. Fuck. I tried not to be rough this time. He gasped and muttered, but she could barely lift her eyelids to look at him. The black eyes glowed like a curious beast in the dark as he dribbled small kisses on her shoulders and neck. He lingered inside her, unwilling to part their bodies that had become one. Under the oak tree. Chapter 19. Did it hurt? Max wanted to tell it was some unpleasantness in the experience, but she shook her head instead. He breathed a sigh of relief and pressed his lips near her temple, and this intimate action somehow filled her heart. It was a feeling she didn't expect. Formerly, she anticipated akin to feeling robbed and trampled. Something painful, empty, cold and bitter would be waiting. Am I heavy? Wait a minute. Riftan propped himself up and slowly pulled his manhood out. Max suddenly felt something trickle down from the inside. He held her back as she tried to squeeze her leg in reflex. Riftan. Stay still. You're tired, aren't you? I'll wipe it for you. Riftan pulled the basin that had been set aside and squeezed the towel wet with the water with it. With the cold cloth, he gently wiped the area meticulously. Doesn't it hurt? Oh, it doesn't hurt. Doesn't it hurt? Max glowed red like a freshly boiled sausage. However, the man, insensitive to her thoughts, only brushed the place carefully and then wiped his lower body. She didn't dare look at him, quickly picking up the sheets to cover herself with it. Riftan smiled at the sight. You'll get used to it soon. Then he flopped down beside her. Max's legs trembled from surprise. Riftan laid so casually in the middle of a spacious bed, even drawing her near with one arm and laying her on top of himself. The feeling of their sweaty skin rubbing made Max feel awkward at the tacky touch. Riftan. Don't struggle unless you want to do it one more time. The remark was not a mere threat, as the lump of flesh that touched her lower abdomen had swollen up again. She froze. With a nonchalant face, Riftan pushed one arm under her head and pulled the sheets up over their joined bodies. Then his eyes slowly drifted shut, as he rested his palm along her wavy locks. Only then Max realized that he was planning to sleep with her. Riftan. Why do you keep calling me? Riftan seemed too natural sleeping with her naked. Her eyes started to the side. Eventually, she swallowed up what she wanted to say and murmured in. Go good night. Silence came as her reply, as if Riftan had already fallen asleep. She listened to his pulse patter from his thick neck, and the rhythm made her soon close her eyes along him. Something was crushing her chest. Max hesitantly opened her eyes in frustration and soon became bewildered. A tanned, strong forearm blocked her vision halfway. She looked up and saw Riftan's sleeping figure, his face half buried in her mane. Max instantly turned red at the fresh memories that resurfaced. They were tangled beneath the blanket without a stitch of a thread between them. The man's long legs were intertwined between her legs, and his arms clasped her tightly within his embrace as if her body were a pillow. Max had never been passionate to anyone. Not even her own mother had hugged her. Her eyes darted around in unease for a moment, thinking it would be better for her to get dressed before Riftan opens his eyes. If he were to wake up like this. Max clasped her face, unable to feel confident looking at him straight. When she remembered her body curling up in his arms last night, she felt so embarrassed that she wanted to jump out of the window. A lady could never react that way. Even the nanny, who had long preached about her duty as the wife, said she should appropriately respond to her husband's demands. She clasped her fiery cheeks. Last night, the struggling, moaning woman was far from forgotten. What if he thinks she's someone not pure? A sudden surge of impatience came into her mind. Max carefully slipped out of his arm and looked under the bed. She could never face him at this rate. Dressing up like a lady may be too much, but at the very least she thought it would be fitting to escape from her current nakedness. She found a random tangle of clothes in the corner of the room and reached for it urgently. Her eyes burned to them desperately. It was a distance she could reach without having to move. And it was so that she didn't have the courage to wander around the room naked. Therefore, she stretched out a hand, but suddenly was flipped, falling back. "What are you doing?" Max looked back at him with a perplexed look. Riftan, who she thought was dead asleep, was now staring down at her with his onyx eyes. She hurriedly tried to get away from him, but it proved to be an impossible feat. He rolled her nimbly back with one arm around her waist, locking her under him. Riftan. "Oh, it's morning." Under the oak tree. Chapter 20. Yes. It's morning. I thought I was going to die waiting for you to open your eyes. He pressed his lips on her eyelids as he said this, the strange touch making Max cringe. At her reaction, he grinned and smacked his lips more fervently on her face, her ears, and neck, pouring his tingling kisses like the touch of butterfly. Max reflexively shoved his face away in embarrassment. Don't, stop now and get dressed. No. Do you know how long I've been holding it up all night? The man snorted and held her hand to his lips. His damp tongue licked her finger in a subtle way that still managed to ignite lightning in her senses. She could hear her pulse drum against her ear. He placed her finger deeper into his mouth and gently sucked on it. Never had Max thought that her hand could be such a sensitive area. "Really, if you knew how I feel every time you blush like that, you wouldn't show me that look, would you?" Riftan mumbled, biting her fingertips. She couldn't stand it any longer and pulled her hand out and hid it in a blanket. Then he wriggled his eyebrows and rolled off the sheet. She shrieked and curled into a circle. "Why are you hiding it?" "Oh, it's morning. It's so bright. So show me. I want to see your body in the light." The man pulled her crouched legs and she cried in surprise. It seemed too unreal that it was only yesterday when she was shivering on the floor in her father's castle, and now lying naked in bed with a man in broad daylight. Not privy to her thoughts, Riftan gently stroked her shoulders, her chest, waist and sides, then his hand naturally settled between her thighs. Last night's act brought his fingers to her wet spot out of familiarity. "Maxie, yesterday. It wasn't bad, was it?" Riftan. "No. It felt good, didn't it?" Even if she died, she could not bring herself to answer his words. His fingers skillfully began to move in her secret place. I loved you to death. 3 years ago, I wanted to be with you, not through vindictive measures. You don't know how hard it was to get out of that bed. Of course, you wanted me to disappear, but..." At such an unexpected remark, she forgot her shame and opened her eyes wide. He placed his mouth under her collarbone, and she felt him smile against her skin. "It's the same as it was now. I can't stop with you. Even if you don't like it. Even if you cry." He dipped his finger deep and bit her skin lightly. Max reflexively tightened against him with her legs. This prompted a thrilled groan to escape from his lips. "Blame it on your bad luck to be the wife of a man like me." What on earth could he mean? In comparison, her side felt far unfortunate in many ways. Her father went so far as to insinuate that she was someone easily replaceable even in marriage. But why does he feel that? The faint question soon faded as the heat in her stomach called her attention. She tightened against his fingers, moving aggressively inside. His feverish gaze swept over her whole body and she couldn't turn her eyes away from his strong gaze, hooked. He pulled his finger out of her and pushed himself deeply at once. Unk. Certainly. I'm dying. Riftan let out a low, strangled moan and gently bit the lower part of her earlobe. She clasped his stony shoulders tightly, feeling as if she had been caught by a hound. Grabbing both of her thighs, he opened them wide enough that they almost hurt and began to move slowly. Max buried her face in the pillow and suppressed her moans. Like a slow, lagging stream, the movements gradually grew stronger. Riftan, which had been moving above for a long time, fell heavily atop her as he reached his peak. She heaved a short breath, in contrast to the long, hoarse exhale over the top of her head. I want to stay like this for a few days. It's heavy. She muttered with a panicked face. At this rate, she didn't think she would be able to get up for days with him weighing her down. He bitterly bit her ear in reply. Oh, that hurts. It's because you say you don't like it, when in fact it feels good. He chewed her blushing earlobe and licked it with his tongue. Max recoiled and moved from his neck. Riftan. It feels really good. I could have stayed like this if it wasn't for that fucking lizard. If I had, we'd have 1 or 2 kids by now, wouldn't we? Don't do it. Riftan continued to play with her ears and rubbed his warm body on her body as if he could not hear a word Max had said. Meanwhile, she had been exhausted by her seemingly never-ending duty in bed. But it seems like he was not even a bit tired, sitting between her legs again. Max almost burst into tears. The moment she had rather fainted, she suddenly stopped moving. It was because someone banged on the door. Under the oak tree. Chapter 21. Damn it. What? Please, open up. See that the sun is up in the sky. How long are you going to fool around in bed? From the door came a violent outburst. Riftan threw his fierce gaze towards the man standing outside, as if his vision could cut through the material. If you interrupt me a second time, I'll take your guts out. And if you dare protest, I'll kill you. We need to leave. Did you forget you still have to go back to the capital after you visit your estate? It's not like we're going to die if we delay for a day, so don't fuck with me. Leader. Go. You've been acting up for a little bastard. He shook his head and furiously cried. Max froze. This was the first conversation with nasty swearing she had ever heard in her life. Then, Riftan raised himself up with a troubled face and shouted out at the door. Put the wagon on hold. I'll get ready and go. His opponent outside the door banged away incessantly, refusing to budge. Riftan sighed loudly, looking down at the floor. I shouldn't have brought those children with me. Wait for a minute. I'll go out and get some clothes for you. With a pale, weary face, she pulled the sheet to her neck and nodded. The man who was standing, and was in the middle of picking up his clothes, looked at her tear-streaked face and frowned. What? Why are you looking at me like that? Spit it out. If you haven't noticed it yet, I'm in a hurry. She hasn't missed it at all. Her husband, who she was reunited just yesterday, had an extremely fiery temper. She murmured timidly. Well, the people outside, the people. You know. You know what? What we did here. Her face glowed as if it was set on fire. The man's mouth suddenly twitched at the corner as he gazed down her blushing face. The next moment, beyond all incredulity, he tossed the garments and went for the sheets. Riftan. Oh, you're driving me crazy. He grinned breathlessly as he hugged her body and lifted her onto his lap. Max fluttered her legs in embarrassment. He was laughing so innocently, far from the overbearing man from before, and she couldn't believe it. You naive noble woman. Of course, my men know what we did. There's no such thing as a couple, who were reunited after 3 years of separation, would sleep in one room merely holding hands. But it's nothing to be ashamed of. We're married, and it's natural for you and me to do this and that. Natural? She knew it was her duty as his wife, but what he shared with her didn't seem natural. Suddenly Max was surprised at her own thoughts. Shared? Was the deed they did last night something of a give-and-take scenario? She couldn't figure out why she felt this way. After all, it was all an act one had to endure to have a child. You're right again. And it's not just them. But don't be afraid. I don't have the confidence to finish it before they break in. He kissed her playfully on the tip of her nose and lowered her down from his lap. She sat around the sheets like a cocoon in a corner of the bed, rubbing the spot on her nose he had left his touch. Riftan bent down and picked up the clothes he had discarded and began to wear them one by one. She rapidly turned her eyes away from the sight of him unabashedly dressing in front of her with his naked body. He quickly donned his armor and said, "I'll stand right outside and wait." She nodded her head gently. At first, her legs trembled to the point she couldn't budge no matter how much she tried. But as Riftan went out of the room with a sword on his waist, she finally crawled towards her bedside to open the window. Under the pale autumn sky, a dense village unfolded before her. A wide dirt road with clear marks of the wheels of the wagon, 5 or 6 wooden cabins, a sparse meadow and a broad orchard. Max, who looked at the simple scenery one by one, suddenly felt a stinging glance and lowered her head. In front of the inn, a carriage has been parked where 3 of the knights who accompanied Riftan stood tall and looked up at her. She shut the window in a hurry. Although she covered herself with sheets, she was embarrassed to be seen in her unscrupulous state as if she was about to sleep. Perhaps they've delayed their departure because of me? She bit her lips nervously. It was a long time that passed before she heard another sound. Someone knocked on the door. She asked carefully. Who are you? I brought water to wash. See, come on in. She crouched in the corner of the bed with her sheets wrapped around her body. The 2 maids who came in with a large basin, a water kettle and a white towel exchanged eyes with awkward faces. We have been instructed by your husband to serve you, but... Oh, no. I can do this. He said you'd need help. She turned steaming red like her hair. Well, really, it's all right. My husband, say I'll do it. Under the oak tree. Chapter 22. The women left the room without further admonition, leaving what they had brought on the table. Max remained seated, waiting until they had gone far enough before she got up and closed the door. She then began to soak up the clean towel with the warm water on and wiped her body, that had been overworked all night, with it. It wasn't quite a refreshing feeling to feel the wet towel on her skin drenched with sweat and fluid. She wiped away the traces of last night. There were many red marks on the shoulders, forearms, thighs, legs and chest. Will it be like this? Memories of last night rose in her mind, and her cheeks swarmed ember. Even though such marks couldn't disappear, she soaked up the towel and still rubbed the red spot vigorously. When she spent the night with him, she only felt embarrassment, but it was not as horrible as the first night. No, she even felt bliss when he hugged and kissed her tenderly, all the while smiling at her softly. No one had ever done such a thing to her. But her husband, who she always thought disapproved of her, not only did he take himself seriously as his wife, but he even seemed to like her in some ways. She remembered how he said he didn't want to leave even on the first night. 3 years ago, I wanted to be with you, I didn't want to leave. You don't know how hard it was to get out of that bed. She soaked her face in the basin to cool off the soaring heat. It was all like a dream. Max meticulously took care of her tangled hair like a vine with the soap and squeezed the water out of the towel. Then, she applied perfume evenly and brushed her locks carefully, but then she heard knocking again. Madam, your husband has sent you a change of clothes. This time, Max opened the door and only received his clothes. It was a rosy dress with golden embroidery. When she unfolded it, the waistband, the breast strap and the thin cloth that appeared to be underwear rolled down. Max's face glowed red when she saw it. The underwear was not much different from the nanny had saved. Her face was so hot that she thought it would burn any moment now. In such a simple town, she could only wonder how she could have gotten it. This isn't his cup of tea. Or is it? She clasped her face in unbearable shame and made a strange sound. Yet again she heard a thumping on the door. This time it was a Riftan. Maxie, did you get your clothes? Are you all dressed? Oh, not yet. Hurry up, we have to leave quickly. Now, wait a second. His impetuous voice made her dress hurriedly in the underwear that seemed to make little difference. She quickly put on some white underpants and the sumptuous dress over her head. It was not easy because she had never worn such clothes without help before. She pulled her sky-high skirt over and stretched it long to her ankles and tightened her belt. But the strings on her back was unrelenting and she groaned for a long time, almost having a cramp in her shoulder. It was when Riftan rapped at the door again. Not there yet? Well, oh, over here. What? Who? Anyone can help. A person, one person, call for them again. Oh, the back, behind my clothes. Open the door. Yes? Open the door. Caught by his urging, Max opened the door with one hand to keep the clothes from slipping down. Riftan, who pushed his way through, shut the door behind him and carefully scanned her. Max was clueless and apologized hurriedly. "I'm sorry for being late, I'm sorry, but the clothes are." "I'm not angry, so don't apologize. I didn't know much about women's clothes, so I didn't even think how it would be uncomfortable to wear and take off," he said, looking down her skirt and long sleeves. She squeezed her fingers in an awkward silence. Did the fancy dress truly suit her? Maybe it looked ridiculous. While she was hesitating, he held her by the shoulder and turned her around. "I'll do it for you." "Oh, well, there." Then he grabbed the string and began to tie them one by one with cautious hands. The rustling noise made Max nervous. He fumbled with the unfamiliar for a while before he allowed her to turn back. "It's done." "All right, thank you. I got it from a merchant staying nearby, so I'm afraid it won't be to your fancy. But for now, you have to put up with this. I'll give you better clothes when I arrive at the estate." She blinked her eyes. She already thinks this outfit is very luxurious, but it wasn't to him? It was depressing. Max did not live a life of luxury as he thought. All the descendants of the Duke of Qua were all given to Rosetta. All of Max's clothes were made by the maids and roughly made from the rest of their fabric. She had never worn anything with such fancy embroidery. Still, Riftan seemed worried that she might be dissatisfied. Maybe he's a person who thought she's used to more beautiful apparel. She swallowed, feeling her throat run dry. She felt fortunate that she didn't bring any of her luggage and avoid humiliation by revealing her shabby wardrobe. She then spoke with a nonchalant air, pretending to straighten her skirt. This dress is not bad for me, either." She looked into his eyes, acting as if she were haughty, but the man merely hung a robe over her shoulders without any signs of upset. She cast her eyes on the delicate palette of her cloak. It seemed so strange that a knight like him would be so tender to her. Under the oak tree. Chapter 23. "Come on, let's go out." Finally, Riftan, who made her wear leather shoes on her feet, said. She nodded with a blush. They went out of the room, came upon a wooden staircase. Taking Riftan's hand into her own, they went down. The armor-clad knights sat in their seats inside the cluttered tavern, where tables and chairs were closely packed. "Leader, I thought we were still staying. So we are leaving now?" One of them grumbled with his arms folded over his chest. But Riftan only took hold of her hand and went outside, completely ignoring them. Then a knight standing by the door chased after him and complained. "Leader, are you going to continue doing that? It's not like we're used to it, but don't just take it for granted." "Quiet. I told you not to say anything." Max looked up at the knight that had been talking with a puzzled look. The young man with large build and curly hair shot her with disapproving eyes in return. She hid herself behind the Riftan, daunted by the piercing gaze that was not mixed with any goodwill. The blond man standing behind the knight snorted loudly. "It's not funny. Only because she's the daughter of the Duke of Qua. I told you to shut your mouth." Riftan growled vehemently. The men clammed up at his ferocious spirit at once. He turned around again and pushed her into the carriage. "Don't mind what they say," Riftan, who was then on the wagon, said, and closed the door roughly. "They don't look too kindly to your father. But you're Madame Calypse, not Qua anymore. You are my wife. I'll warn them not to be rude again." She couldn't find a word to answer, only gazing at the back of her hand on her lap. Only because she's the daughter of the Duke of Qua, the words reminded her of how this relationship with him took place. "Are you offended by my men?" Seeing her sit quietly, he asked in a nervous tone. She looked up in surprise. Has anyone ever cared about her feelings at all? She smiled unconsciously as she looked at his troubled face. What a strange man, she thought. "You know what?" "Yes, what?" "You smiled at me. This is the first time." Riftan, who was staring down at her face with an indecipherable expression, slowly reached out and stroked her cheek. Max was caught up in his intense gaze and stopped breathing. The man, whose lips were half open, as if to say something, soon pulled his hand away. Then, he yelled at the men outside, as if nothing had ever occurred a moment ago. "What are you waiting for? Who was the one who begged us to get going?" She heard murmurs from outside and soon the carriage rolled. She glanced at his face in an awkward silence. Riftan had his head against the carriage window, closing his eyes as if he was tired. Feeling a little relaxed now, she also leaned her head against the wall. The carriage shook and tossed, feeling like the rhythm of a cradle. Perhaps, with the tension of several days finally reaching its peak, she gradually fell asleep. Leaving the village where they stayed on the first day, they traveled through the vast greenery all day long. Running a carriage on a poorly managed dirt road only made them reach a small village near the forest when it was completely dark. After traveling in a cramped space for the first time, Max was beyond exhausted. Riftan, who had gone outside first to identify himself, returned to the carriage to pick up his sleeping bag and lamp from the luggage compartment. "We're staying here today. It's chilly, so hold on to your clothes tight." She followed his words, pressing the hood lower over her head. Carefully holding the strap of her coat, she stepped down from the carriage and they strode to where the knights gathered, Riftan's arm wrapped loosely around her shoulder. One of the knights, who had a long talk with the guard, looked back at him and asked him with an embarrassed look. "Leader, what are your orders? They don't have any rooms to accommodate us." Riftan picked up the lamp and looked around quickly. 4 or 5 dark cottages were lined up beside the winding dirt road, with their lights out. The knight quickly added an explanation. "There are 5 cabins and they are full of serfs who came down for the harvest season. There's an empty grain warehouse. We can borrow that for a day." The knight glanced at Max's face towards the end of his speech. Riftan's forehead creased and he looked back to the guard. "Is there a place where my wife can stay separately?" "It's just a shabby cabin built to house the serfs during the harvest season. If you tell me, I can have them leave for you right now. But I'll tell you now, it won't be a seemly place for a lady. But it's better than the warehouse. If you could just clear a cabin for her, I'd like to give you a generous." I'm fine, it's all right." Max caught hold of his arm in a fit of fear. Not only was it burdensome for the serfs, who had suffered from hard labor all day, to be driven out because of her, but also didn't want to spend the night alone in these spooky, unfamiliar places. Looking around with frightened eyes, Max grabbed Riftan's sleeve. I don't want to be alone." Under the oak tree. Chapter 24. When a strange silence came, she was overcome with astonishment of what she said, and let go of his tunic instantly. The fever went up to the scruff of her neck. Is he surprised with her brazen words? After all, he was entirely mute. She couldn't look straight up at Riftan's face, fearing his expression now, and only grabbed the hem of her skirt. The people around them, awkwardly glancing at each other, continued their conversation calmly. "We'll leave you to it and take a rest first. I'm starving. I also want to let the horse rest first. Hey, where can we find water here? There's a stream next to the mill. This way, please." As the men were busily dispersed, Riftan, who was standing silently, pulled her hand. "We'll go, too." Yes. She shifted her gait in a flurry to chase the leading Riftan strolling with his long legs. The ground was uneven, and she nearly tripped several times, but Riftan helped her up by steadying her with his strong arm. Walking along the narrow ditch for some time, a large wooden building appeared in the dim darkness. The men who entered the room first hung lamps everywhere to brighten the dark interior. Max walked inside along the Riftan and looked around. It didn't seem at all strange if evil spirits came out immediately. Everywhere the light came into contact, a spider's web flashed like a hazy ghost's hair, and the white, dusty floor beneath them squeaked with every step. She shifted her steps carefully to see if there were rats or bugs crawling on the floor. The men settled down with casual faces, laid their sleeping bags and threw off their cumbersome defenses one by one. Riftan also spread a thick layer of straw on a corner and spread a sleeping bag over it. "Come here." Although Max felt as if she was about to faint, she couldn't just lie down in place full of fleas. It was quite a large space, but when numerous people were brought in, it suddenly felt cramped. "It'll be an uncomfortable sleeping experience for a while. Just hang in there until we get to Anatole." He took off his breastplate and gloves, pushing it to the side as he released the tension on his neck with a pop. She sat with her knees in her arms and nodded quietly. But Max had never stayed in the same room with such many men, so she could hardly relax. The knights, however, seemed to care less about her existence, and were busy preparing meals with the brazier. "Leader, we don't have enough left to feed the horses. What are your orders?" One of the knights who followed the guard shouted, shoving his head into the warehouse. Riftan loosened his leather belt and responded casually. "Ask the guard if we can buy grain. We negotiated it. But all the food in the storage is the property of the Duke of Gua, so they can't handle it as they please." She shivered unconsciously at the sudden mention of her father's name. Riftan brushed his head roughly and clicked his tongue. "He's just asking for a higher price. What shall I do? Give him as much as he wants. I don't think you have to go that far, perhaps we can scare." The knight, who gave a casual remark, stopped in his words as soon as he caught sight of Max. "Well, there's nothing to do with the Duke so far. All right. I'll negotiate for you, so don't scold me about the light pocket later. Then he went out of the warehouse again. Max felt the enmity of the knights against her father was stronger than she had expected and shrank. She surmised it was because of their hard feelings that they pretended not to notice her existence. Would it have been different if she looked as attractive as Rosetta? She reminisced of her stepsister, who received all kinds of gifts and letters, her admirers who regularly visited the castle that she wasn't able to see. Riftan, who had been rummaging through the fire for a long time, returned with a large bowl. She looked up into the bowl, which had been cooked in bonfire. It was filled with baked potatoes. It's hot, so eat carefully. Even though he said so, he picked up a steaming one with his calloused hands and took it in one big bite. Max took out a potato after him. She carefully grabbed the charcoal-like hot food with her sleeve, and peeled off the tan skin, revealing the tender flesh inside. After she had puffed out the steam from the potatoes, and carefully taken off the peel, hunger, which she had not recognized, suddenly surged in. She gulped down the baked potatoes, not caring if the roof of her mouth burned. The potatoes that were slightly undercooked could not have been more delicious. She quickly ate it all up from her hands. Then Riftan, who had been watching from beside her, pulled out another potato that had been peeled in advance. She panicked and waved her hands in embarrassment. Riftan, take it. It's fine. Don't mince your words, take it. He threw it towards her without any second hesitation and took another potato out of the bowl. Then he peeled and bit it with his mouth wide open. She looked down at her potato, which had been peeled clean, blew away the steam that rose and ate it. When her stomach was somewhat full, she was overcome with drowsiness. She put her head on her sleeping bag, forgetting it might have lice on it. The red light flowed from the brazier, which was placed in the center of the warehouse, and shone softly all over the place. Even the knights, who had finished with their meal, were prepared for slumber on their respective sleeping bags. She said she would, but she still felt embarrassed to sleep among strangers, so she pulled the blanket to the end of her chin. Then Riftan, who was sitting at her bedside grooming his sword, lay beside her and hugged her tightly with one arm. Max shoved his arm away quickly. Riftan. There's people here. Nobody cares, so stay calm. It's cold. Under the oak tree. Chapter 25. Max felt the heat from Riftan's body, his chin making contact with her unruly hair as he locked an arm around her neck. She had the strangest inkling, thinking he did it because he thought she was cold, and peeked at him from beneath her eyelashes, at a loss what to do. True to his words, no one paid attention to their closeness, perhaps they pretended not to. Still, Max wasn't thick-faced enough to be so close to a man. Even if it were her husband. Her tongue mustered the proper words to say, wary of his possible ire. I'm okay. I mean. You just be a little further away. You're troubling her. Please be considerate. Max raised her head at the sudden voice that interrupted them. Not only was it an ordinary disruption, but a subordinate berating Riftan, their supposed captain. She found that it came from a slender young man, appearing to be in his early 20s, standing 3 or 4 steps away with a small lamp in his hand. Don't be nosy, Ruth. Leave, Riftan sighed, almost impatiently. Unfazed by his cold reception, Ruth managed to reply coolly. How long are you going to keep growling like a barbarian? I'm not going to bother you, so you can cease doing that. At such brazen words, Max's eyes opened wide in surprise. The man who relentlessly engaged in speaking against Riftan caught sight of her gaze, and this time his sights turned towards her. Feeling as if he had seen her doing something discourteous, Max stood up in a hurry. As if held by a string, Riftan followed after her, sitting up reluctantly. What's your business? He finally said, his tone a tad milder than before. I brought it, he raised the glowing light, because I thought you'd be cold. Although the you in question was left unspoken, it was obvious it was Max he was referring. His hands then dived for the pockets in his sides, rummaging for quite some time before taking it out again. Tiny pebbles that emitted soft lights lit the man's palm. Upon seeing it, Max felt tranquility wrap around her. The lights grew nearer with the man's steps. The man a stone of fire. It's a spell to keep you warm. Here, take it and keep it close to you, he said. Max instantly felt flustered. Me? Sir, this is for me? She couldn't keep off the surprise from showing at the unexpected kindness, making the man's eyebrows raise in turn. Who else? The people gathered here are strong men who can even stay naked under the resilient frost, he spat out with a careless attitude, not caring one bit if it were a woman on the receiving end of his words. He then continued explaining, But you're different. It looks like you don't have much stamina either. In any case, it'll be my responsibility if you catch a cold here. Think of it as a preventive measure." Upon hearing she could be a burden, Max accepted it into her hands without another word. Warm air gently enveloped her whole body as soon as the stone was in her hands, just as he had explained. For a moment when she was merely staring at the stone in wonder, she soon realized that she had not yet thanked him for his generosity. Her head raised in panic. Thank you. Sir Ruth." The man's taciturn countenance softened at her mumbled gratitude. "I am not a knight but a wizard. You may call me Ruth," he said. The man then turned and went back to his seat on the other side, as if finished with whatever purpose he had. Riftan, who had been watching their exchange in silence, laid back down and pulled her with him. Max could feel the tremor in his touch and the nervousness that came with it. "You're tired," he started. "Go to sleep. We'll leave tomorrow as soon as the first light of dawn breaks." Riftan's hand then moved to turn off the light from the oil lamp placed by his side. As if the other knights had been waiting for him, the lights in the room extinguished in dominoes, submerging the place in gloomy darkness. Max, who was wriggling uncomfortably in the man's arms, could not endure the terrible fatigue that came and closed her eyes. The steady drumming from the chest her cheek was in contact with sounds much of a lullaby. And instantly, her worries of sleeping in such quarters faded, replaced only by a deep slumber. As morning descended, what was once the creepy semblance of the village from last night was gone, replaced by a lively glow. Before one's eyes, a beautiful panoramic view of the Utical forest lay beyond the row of huts like a backdrop. Unending golden fields of wheat stretched before her sight, moving like ocean waves on a calm morning. Max left the warehouse to wash her face with the only stream available. In the early morning, the water was chilly enough almost to freeze her hands. She wet her long, tangled hair like a vine with it, the cool breeze kissing her damp face, and making her spine erupt in goosebumps at the slight wind. Finding little efforts for grooming could be done, Max returned to the warehouse, carefully wiping the water off her face with the sleeves of her dress. She saw the knights had already gathered in front of the carriage upon her return, ready for departure. Riftan was the first to catch sight of her. "Hey, don't go around alone. I'm sorry." At his stern voice, she dropped her head and rushed forward. Riftan then lifted her to the carriage, his frown still in place, as if he still had a lecture for her. And as expected, he then added, "Don't ever act on your own. The Utical woods house a lot of monsters." Max trembled, recalling the horrendous beings she had seen on the first day. However, it was her helplessness against their attacks that made her shake in fear. Yes, I'll be careful." Under the oak tree. Chapter 26. Riftan's face visibly loosened. "All right then. I'm an extra load if I sit inside, so I'll be riding my horse from now on. Call me if you feel uncomfortable." Riftan then closed the carriage door before him. After some time, of which Max tried to seat herself comfortably, the familiar jolt of the carriage signaled the wheels were moving against the dirt road. Max glanced at every passing scenery at the window, finding the expansive wheat field drift away from her vision to be replaced by a view of dense, menacing trees. The sunlight crept through the leaves, bathing the place in gold, akin to the soft threads of a woven veil. Meanwhile, the knights majestically sat on their horses, surrounding the carriage in the middle. Max squinted hard, expecting another monster to make a sudden appearance from the woods. Contrary to her concerns, the journey this time was smooth and quiet. It was soon her constant apprehension of making sure she wouldn't stumble inside the rocking carriage that drained her physical strength. It didn't help when the road still didn't get better after some time. Minutes passed by slowly, and it was unknown how much time had elapsed when finally, the carriage that had been moving for a long time stopped. Riftan appeared before her, opening the door and uttering the words she wanted to hear badly. "We'll take a break here." Max skipped out of the carriage all too eagerly. In no time, her sudden actions made blood rush to her leg that had gone stiff from sitting. As an unpleasant tingling sensation settled on her legs, she swallowed a groan and bent over to rub some friction on her legs. Riftan then took off his thick overcoat and placed it over a rock, sitting her on it as if it were a cushion. Without waiting for Max's reaction, of which he knew would be a refusal, he knelt on one knee and began to massage her cramped muscles. With an embarrassed face, Max hurriedly looked around. Some of the knights who were giving their horses water to drink stood away, their sights on anything but them. But Max could see the unmistakable astonishment on their faces. Max pushed Riftan's shoulders away, her cheeks turning scarlet red. Riftan, oh, gee goodness. You don't have to. I'm all right. Is it a habit? He asked out of the blue. What? Riftan wrapped her calf around the hem of his shirt, rubbing it lightly against the cloth. With a low voice, he mumbled, "It's all right. Don't be afraid to talk." Max couldn't figure out by what habit Riftan meant, her stuttering or the times she always insisted on doing things on her own in fear of being a nuisance. Whatever of the two, warmth blossomed inside her chest. Unable to find the proper words, her sights trailed down at his strong hands carefully pressing her legs. All the while, she busied herself studying the tendons that ran along the length of his buff arm, yet the question of "why are you being so nice to me?" couldn't escape her mind. Something tickled in her stomach, an uncomfortable sensation as if she was wearing clothing with the wrong fitting. "Oh, now. I'm truly fine." Max tried to force her leg out from his hold. Riftan barely moved before she rose from her seat in visible fluster. Her hands pretended to straighten her skirt for no reason. "I'll bring you something to eat, so rest for now." The man rose silently from his seat, only returning later bringing bread and dried meat. Max soaked the dry, sturdy bread in water and ate it curiously. After finishing her meal, she carefully glanced towards Riftan, sneaking a wary look towards the bushes behind him some distance away. The monotonous journey commenced, and Max found herself listlessly counting the passing trees in the rocking carriage from boredom. It came to the point the foliage became thicker that less light could pass. Then when it was too dark to proceed any further, the knights halted and scoured for a place to rest. Only when they had sufficiently checked the surroundings free from stray animals and wild beasts did Max leave the carriage. Grabbing a lamp with her hands, she approached the busy Riftan pitching up a small tent near her carriage. Meanwhile, all the other knights lay their beddings on the other side, forming a circle around the bonfire. The forest gets submerged in a fog at dawn. So if you don't want to freeze, you'll have to put up with this poor roof. Upon noticing her presence, Riftan, who was fastening the fabric tightly at the ground, looked back and explained to Max. Max bent down, examining the insides of the waist-high triangular tent and found that it could fit only one person. She unconsciously said towards Riftan, "Two aren't you? Isn't it too narrow for two people to sleep?" Max, with a tilt of her head, casually posed the harmless question. The man's hand, who had been dutifully hammering a stake on the other side of the ground, suddenly stopped. There was a hint of embarrassment on his face as he looked back at her. A faint blush in his cheeks. "I'm going to sleep here alone. You are going to rest in the carriage." Max's face suddenly warmed, and in no time, she was as red as a beet. How awkward her thoughts have strayed, even going as far as to think they would lay down on the same bed together. Max added in a hurry, stumbling on her own words, "Oh, sleeping with me, oh no. Alone, that's what I thought you were doing it for. Look at me. I barely put up with it yesterday." With a deep sigh, Riftan bowed his head with a troubled face. Then he muttered a curse, and grabbed her hand, dragging her somewhere deeper into the dark forest. Max staggered after him. Even with just a little distance from camp, the dark that enveloped them was still frightening. The whistle of the passing wind rustled the leaves overhead and the cries of the birds filled the air around them. It all came as a chilling melody in her ears and Max clasped her hands over them in fear, as a futile effort to block out the sound. After walking some time, the man then pushed her body behind a large, wooden post, crashing his lips down on hers in haste and pent-up passion. Max gasped at the unexpected act. Taking advantage of it, Riftan sucked her soft tongue into his mouth, tasting it with an intense longing. As she tried to shake her head away from the strange sensation, he held her face closer and kissed her deeper. Riftan's soft hair tickled Max's forehead, and his large, calloused palms gently swept around her cheeks towards the back of her neck. He twisted her head lower, giving him better access to her mouth as he devoured her. His tongue swept all over the flesh of her mouth, her tongue, her cheeks, the roof of her mouth. As sticky saliva trickled down their lips, dampening their jaws, Riftan licked it down and mumbled, "I had to suffer this all night." He grabbed her hand and placed it on a sacred place on his body. Max immediately felt his bulging manhood under her palms and shuddered. She tried to pry her hands off in a hurry as if scalded, but the arm holding her wouldn't budge with her meager strength displayed. "Do you know how difficult it is to lie down and sleep in this state?" Under the oak tree. Chapter 27. Riftan poured out kisses as if he were trying to devour Max, pinned between a wooden post and his hard body. He grasped her backside with both hands and pulled her closer, rubbing his swollen groin on her lower stomach. Her body instantly responded, warming to his touch. Fearing her surprising reaction, Max twisted away quickly from his hold. "No. Not here," she said. "You're driving me crazy." Riftan let out a low moan and leaned his head against the tree in exasperation. Feeling his shoulders soar up and down, Max became nervous. It was apprehension that stemmed from his incoming anger because of her rejection. But contrary to her thoughts, he only backed away, with painstaking effort, from her. Riftan patted her cheek and said, "You'll sleep alone in the wagon tonight," he said as if he were speaking to a naive child. She barely mustered a small nod, feeling embarrassment creep up. The man took her hand in his again and walked her back to the camp. Seeing their return, a giant knight sitting on a rock, who was igniting a fire, grinned. "Leader, you're faster than I thought. Isn't your sword so old that it's rusted?" Riftan's footsteps halted, and he turned to the man. Although the knight was snickering, there was no hint of any ill will on his face. When he saw this, he leaned his sword against the tree and muttered, contempt present in his voice, "Bastard. How noble is the master of the Rikaido family." Another knight joined in. "Nobler than yours, that's a given." "What? How dare you speak to me like that? This guy goes behind everyone's back. Og. You bastard." The man tried to kick the blonde knight's legs. He jumped out from his seat, grabbing his sword to rush at him. The latter also drew his sword and casually pointed it at the man's throat. At the fearsome display, Max was shocked and hid behind Riftan's back. Riftan wrapped an arm around her shoulder and gave the men a fierce glare. "You seem to have a lot of energy. So both of you can take turns keeping watch tonight." "Leader." Both objected at once. Riftan continued walking towards the wagon, pretending not to hear their protests. Max looked over his shoulders and saw the two men threatening to kill each other behind his back. Riftan merely turned her face towards his and said, "Don't worry about them. They always fight like this." Max nodded her head. She grasped that not all of the knights have a good relationship with each other. Riftan put her in the wagon and started putting up the tent they had left again. As he worked, she sat at the entrance of the wagon with a lit lamp beside her, offering light in the gloomy surrounding. After laying a sleeping bag inside the tent, he sat down on a tree root protruding next to him and started sharpening his sword, as he always did. A few moments later, two knights who had been scouting around returned with 3 blackbirds, both about the size of a goose. They grabbed the wings of the birds and twisted them, tearing them apart and peeling them off their feathers all at once. Max only froze in surprise. The torn wings laid on the ground, a sickening sight for her, as the knights cut the bird's leg with a sharp dagger and tossed their feathers in a pile. Max hurriedly ran inside the wagon, trying to hold the bile that rose from her throat. A while later, Riftan brought her some of the roasted meat, but she didn't feel like eating it. She refused even one bite and just ate bread with a little cheese. Riftan glanced at her, biting into the lean meat. "It will take a few more days to get out of here. Until then, you must fill your body so you'll have enough strength." I'm eating well." Riftan raised his eyebrows as if he wanted to say something. But he just finished eating his meal with a sigh. Meanwhile, Max consciously tried to avoid looking at the feathers piled up near the fire, like darkness on the brown ground. Late into the night, the air got much colder and denser. As the other knights lay down one by one in their tents, Max laid down on the thick sleeping bag placed on the carriage seat. Occasionally, she would hear the cries of beasts in the night and the rustling of leaves. Feeling an eerie chill on her back, she opened the door and looked down at the tent where Riftan was sleeping. When she saw his long legs sticking out, her mind was relieved for some reason. She laid her head down again to sleep, but the cries of the birds who seemed to mourn their fallen friend kept her awake all night. Under the oak tree. Chapter 28. Max, who tossed and turned all night, and only managed to fall asleep at dawn, was awoken suddenly by a loud sound. In the dawning light, the knights were putting on their armor piece by piece. She washed her face and brushed her messy hair back with her hands, as she usually did in the lack of proper commodities. The knights announced their departure while ravenously eating their bread and chugging water. She also ate the simple meal as she sat in her seat, listening to them. After a while, the wagon began to roll vigorously, and Max's entire body once again rattled uncomfortably in the carriage. The knights, who had been bracing themselves for incoming monsters, grumbled that they hadn't even seen a common forest goblin. But she didn't want to see any goblins. They traveled half the day without stopping, and then they stopped for a quick lunch by a small fountain before setting off again. Riftan held her hand tight all day, so she would not lose her balance in the swaying wagon. Max couldn't even say, "Can't we just take a short break?" So as when night fell, She felt immensely relieved. She hungrily devoured the food Riftan handed her, then fell asleep as soon as she laid her head on the makeshift pillow. Since Max got a good night's rest, the next day was much better. They moved from early dawn until the sun sunk beyond the Judean forest. She breathed a sigh of relief when she noticed the vibration of the wagon had reduced significantly. Unlike the uneven terrain in the very rugged Utica forest, the plains of Anatorium were well paved. She opened her window and looked at the green grass and white wildflowers covering the gentle hills. Perhaps because she saw nothing but thick, gloomy trees for the last few days, the view of the golden plains was breathtaking. "Once we pass that mountain, we'll be in Anatole," Riftan said, then walked to the front of the wagon to speak with the knights who were leading. Max stuck her head out of the window and looked ahead. At the end of the plains, mountain peaks were lined up like fences. "Hang on just a little longer. We'll be there the day after tomorrow. No. As early as tomorrow evening." Max almost started to moan with relief. If she could endure one more day, she could finally sleep in a comfortable bed. She imagined herself filling her stomach with soft bread, thick vegetable soup, jam-filled pie, and liquor after soaking in a hot bath, then laying down on a clean, cozy bed. She needed to hold on a little longer. The wagon only stopped when the sun began to set. As soon as she got out of the carriage, she tried to search for Riftan. She felt as if she was a lost child among the knights who pretended not to notice her. Max crept through the crowd of men busily preparing for camp and saw Riftan with the horses by the river. As she walked towards him, he looked back at her with a puzzled look. "What is it? What's going on?" Max couldn't say that she ran out here just because she couldn't see him, so she bent down and pretended to wash her hands. Riftan squatted down and followed her, washing his hands, and the nape of his neck with the cold water. His long, thick nape flashed like copper, reddish in the glow of the sun. She sneaked a peek at how he cleaned his messed-up hair with his wet hands, the beauty of this man buried in her heart. "Hey, your skirt is all wet." He suddenly stared at her feet. Max stared at him, astonished. She couldn't change for days, so her skirt was covered in dust and was now dripping wet. Embarrassed, she started frantically wiping the mud off her skirt. Riftan knelt in front of her. "Let me handle it." "And no. It's all right." Surprised, she tried to back away, her eyes wide as saucers. Riftan merely grabbed her skirt, soaking the mussy part in the river to rinse it. After washing it as gently as he could, he squeezed the water out. Max leaned over him, not knowing what to do. Knights valued honor more than life itself. Riftan was a knight who did not bow his head to any king without great allegiance. But here he was, kneeling in front of her. Did he have no objection to be on his knees before her because he was born on the low class of society? Max wondered if the other knights would tease him for leaning in front of a humble woman like herself. "You must be cold. Go to the fire and warm up," Riftan said, washing his dirty hands. Max dazedly climbed the hill, yet with caution, so that the hem he had cleaned wouldn't get dirty again. A cold night breeze flew west through the fields, making her tie her hood tightly that her hair wouldn't be messed. From a distance, she watched him water the horses and his clothes. Before she knew it, the sun had fallen behind the mountain, and they were surrounded by an ocean of darkness. Under the oak tree. Chapter 29. "I think the rainy season is about to begin," Riftan, who was about to tether the horses, said, as he looked up at the sky. The sky was rippling with an ominous pattern of fish scales as if it had become the sea. Riftan nodded his head again, knowing that he was right, and the knight who had lightly tossed a log into the fire agreed with him. "I'm depressed just thinking about it. It's awful to wander through these mountains in the rain. My armor feels so heavy and useless, and the ground becomes drenched." The other knights all took off their armor, grunting as they warmed their hands by the fire. "We should have arrived at Anatole by now." "What difference would that make? Did you forget? As soon as we arrive at Anatole, we have to leave for another kingdom in just a few days," another knight threw in. The frowning man snuck a glimpse at Max, who was staring into the fire. "It took much longer because of this horrific wind. Wouldn't it be funny to anger King Reuben even more by delaying further? Well, the rainy season is about to begin. What can we even do about it?" Riftan tied his horse's reins to the post and plopped down next to Max. The blonde knight Ricardo was sitting quietly next to his horse with an unmistakably depressed look on his face. "Does the warrior who defeated the Red Dragon now refuse to respond to the king's call because of some rain? You can't keep your majesty waiting any longer. We've already wasted enough time with this useless work." The man's voice cut across him like a whip on his back. Max's face turned pale and Riftan's face turned red with anger. "Uselin Ricardo. Be careful what you say to me. Riftan then added, who said I would disobey the king? I've just been delayed a bit. The man pursed his lips as if he was about to start shouting again, then he suddenly turned his back and heavy silence fell all around. The only sound that could be heard was the crackle of firewood. One of the knights, known for his impertinent and sometimes thoughtless actions, suddenly spoke up. I agree with our leader. I don't want to get wet in the rain like a mangy dog. We've been through this for 3 years, and I'm ready to go back to our old lives. You pathetic bastard. With this wind. Lord Ricardo and Sir Nerda both have a point. We should instill the power of the Ream Dragon Knights on the capital as soon as we can, argued Ruth, who until then had been sitting quietly in the corner. Then, a knight called Baron triumphantly stood up. Look at that. Even the wizard says that I'm right. It's just raining a bit. There may be time before the rainy season truly begins. Ricardo looked upset but Ruth looked pleased. He had felt a palpable release in the tense atmosphere and secretly breathed a sigh of relief. With this argument, they still hadn't decided about when they would leave for Anatole and the territory of Qua. Max recalled a map of the continent of Rovidan that she saw in the castle library one day. Riftan's estate in Anatole was located on a small peninsula, which stretched like a snake's head toward the southwestern tip of the South Sea of Syria. She was told that it was surrounded by rugged mountains and wide open fields to the south. Weden's capital, Drachium, was located to the far northwest, far above Anatole. The fastest route from Aranthal, where the battle against the dragon commenced, to the royal capital was to go straight up the Wasirium River. She had only a flimsy knowledge of geography, but it seemed clear that they were taking the long way around. It's all my fault. I brought the king's wrath down on us. Max inwardly confessed. Max vaguely understood why Uslin Ricardo was so nervous. Riftan had refused the king's proposal to marry his daughter. The more she thought about this problem, the more her stomach twisted up in knots. No, it's not because of me. There has to be another reason. What other knight in this world would postpone a king's call in order to take his wife home? But she soon got rid of her dark thoughts. It made no sense to blame everything on herself. When the Central Powers are weak, a man with a large tract of land with the military power necessary to maintain and protect it was far more powerful than the king. Weden was after all more stable than the other 6 nations. Moreover, Reuben III is a king who was a strong leader and crucially had the allegiance of hundreds of respected knights. Such a person could not be put on the back burner so easily. Under the Oak Tree. Chapter 30. Now, keep up your spirits, and let's eat. The knight assigned to food duty began to evenly cut the chunks of cheese and distribute the simple meal of cheese, cold meat and bread. They ate the stale brown bread washed down with the wine handed out by Riftan. Soon they all drifted off to sleep. Maybe it was from sheer exhaustion, but Max was too restless to sleep. Tomorrow they would move to a new home. What kind of place would Anatole be? She thought about her fate, and her thoughts wandered in unexpected directions. She was so frightened a few days ago, but now she felt a glimmer of hope somewhere in the corner of her heart. Maybe you can start a new life in this new place. But she forced herself to suppress any expectations. She was terrified of being disappointed again. Not only had she survived the crisis of divorce, but she had also escaped her father's abuse. Her husband, who seemed like a terrible person at first, now didn't seem to be so cold. No, he's a kind person and she saw small but amazing changes happening every day. She knew that the goddess of luck didn't smile often. Max pulled the blanket up to her neck and vowed to keep her mind open no matter what happened. They reached the foothills the next day by midday. As they entered the valley, Max noticed a small watchtower hidden behind trees. 4 guards were sent out hurriedly to greet them. With the guards' guidance, they were able to enter the inn and sit down to eat. After eating their first hot meal in weeks of hot stew and baked potatoes, they got on their horses to continue the journey. Max got out of the wagon and rode with Riftan, since they had to travel as fast as possible before sunset. She had never been on a horse before because she had always been too nervous. As she held her saddle tightly with a stooped posture, Riftan held her firmly with one arm and leaned her against his chest. We're taking a shortcut, so it'll be a rough ride. Lean against me so you can be a little more comfortable. The other knights stayed in a close group with Riftan as they rode over the unfamiliar, unforgiving road. Leader. There are 5 werewolves ahead. As the leading knight shouted, the knights all pulled out their swords in unison. Out of fear, Max grabbed the horse's mane. Riftan shouted and wanted to head towards the battlefield but knew he was encumbered with Max and decided to stay put. Don't let them come this way. Don't worry, we'll stand our ground. A knight named Hebarin ran forward wildly with a piercing shout. At the same time, the ferocious beast's cries rang out. Max shivered and held her breath, burying her face in Riftan's chest. "It'll all be over soon, just close your eyes." She closed her eyes and covered her ears like a child as instructed. However, she couldn't stop the sound of the sword pounding violently or the cry of the angry beast from piercing her eardrum. "Leader! Above us!" After hearing someone else's cry, she unconsciously lifted her head and gave a shrill scream. A black monster on the branches ran towards them like lightning. But before the creature could reach them, it was sliced in two in thin air. She looked down at the black monster lying on the floor, unable to understand what had happened. Riftan spit blood from his mouth and it splashed on the hem of his robe. "Gable, don't you know how to count? There weren't 5, but 6 werewolves." The knight retorted, "Black werewolves have stealth powers and can hide easily." Riftan clicked his tongue, spurring the horse to move forward, and saw monsters with human bodies and wolf heads tangled around the tree roots like snakes. The knights wiped the blood off their swords and got on their horses once again. Max was amazed by how tough they were. A few years ago, she read about werewolves in a book. They were clearly described as having bones as hard as iron, and skin as strong and hard as barbed armor, making it impossible to penetrate. How had Riftan killed such a beast so easily? "There's sure to be more of these beasts around here, so let's hurry." Ruth looked around at the other knights, and they all nodded in unison. The horses ran fast as possible and Max grit her teeth to avoid biting her tongue. She overlooked the mountain road covered with rocks and trees as they passed the peaks.